Time Warner Audiobooks presents A Dream is a Wish Your Heart Makes, written by Annette Funicello with Patricia Romanowski, and read for you by Annette Funicello.
It's probably hard to imagine, but I really don't recall too many details about the day that changed my life and my family's forever. Then again, I was only 12 years old, and a career in show business was the last thing on my mind. For me, the big event of Easter week 1955 was my dance school's year-end recital, Ballet versus Jive. I felt excited and honored to have been chosen to dance the lead role in Swan Lake. I remember very clearly the delicate white dress my mother sewed for me and the white feather headpiece nestled in my curly black hair. I also remember where the recital took place, the Burbank Starlight Bowl, not far from our home in Studio City, California, just over the hills from Hollywood. But what I remember most of all about that very special evening is that it was the night Mr. Walt Disney saw my little swan queen pirouetting across the stage. The next day, one of my dance teachers, Al Gilbert, phoned my mother to say that someone from Disney Studios in Burbank had called him and asked, who was the little dark-haired girl in Swan Lake? Mr. Disney and several of his staff had been in the audience at the Burbank Starlight Bowl, scouting for child performers to appear on his new children's television show called The Mickey Mouse Club. We didn't know much about Walt Disney or his studio, though I had loved his wonderful animated movies such as Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, Cinderella, Pinocchio, and Bambi, my favorite. We lived at the center of the movie industry, but Mr. Disney was not as familiar a figure to the general public as he would become a few years later. This was before he began hosting his weekly television program and opened Disneyland. I have to admit that the Funicello household wasn't exactly jumping at this opportunity, as my mother would often recall. We didn't know what an audition was, and who knew what a mouseketeer was? But Mr. Gilbert asked her to reconsider. Look, he said, to have Annette audition for Mr. Disney will definitely be a feather in my cap. Why don't you just go for the audition and I'll come with you? Mom finally said yes, I would audition. I'm sure no one in the Funicello household seriously thought for 1 second that it would lead to anything. Unlike so many child performers' families, mine didn't make the big move to California to further my career. As a matter of fact, when my parents, Joe and Virginia Funicello, left our hometown of Utica, New York, in the summer of 1946, I had no career. I was only 4 years old and so shy that I would hide behind my mother's skirt every time the doorbell rang. Hardly a threat to Shirley Temple. The reason my parents came to the Golden State was very simple: the weather. My father, a master auto mechanic, had had his fill of sweating through the summers and freezing under cars all winter long. Until then, home for me had been a 2-bedroom apartment on Bleecker Street in Utica, a small city in northern New York State. My father's parents, Anthony and Conjetta, short for Congentina Funicello, were both born in Italy. She came to the United States at the age of 8. My grandfather had arrived many years earlier. They were married in 1915. They were proud of their Italian heritage, as I am today, but not everyone looked fondly upon the new immigrants. Perhaps for this reason, everyone in my father's family, except his parents, began pronouncing their last name not as Funicello, but as something that sounded like Funicello. In other words, they pronounced it the way that someone unfamiliar with the Italian surnames might. It would be many more years before I knew exactly how my name was supposed to be pronounced. I can thank Mr. Disney for that, but that's another story for later. My father was always very quiet and shy. Nonetheless, when he saw my mother, Virginia Albano, it was love at first sight. My mother's parents, Michael and Serafina or Fanny Albano, had come to the United States from the same town in Italy, Caserta, near Naples, but didn't meet until years after they'd immigrated. My grandmother's first husband died very young and left her a widow alone in New York City with 3 small children. Yet my grandfather fell in love with her, married her, and moved them all up to Utica, where his parents, my great-grandparents, lived. Unfortunately, my mother's mother passed away at a fairly young age, so I never got to know her, but I was very close to her father. Grandpa Albano was a large, round man, and what I remember most about him is that he could pick up and play virtually any instrument. I know that my love of music and ability to play several instruments came from him. When I was born on October 22nd, 1942, I was the first grandchild on either side of the family. It's an Italian tradition to name the first baby after the father's same-sex parent. That meant my name should have been Conjantina. Today, my mother jokes that she knew that name would never fit across a Mickey Mouse Club sweatshirt without wrapping around the sides, so it had to be shorter. My grandfather's name was Anthony, so taking the Ann sound, my parents came up with Annette Joanne Funicello. My mother, who'd never owned a doll when she was young, nicknamed me Dolly, which is what my father calls me even today. For as long as I can remember, I felt wanted and loved. And no wonder, with 5 aunts, 5 uncles, my grandparents, and Mom and Dad to dote on me. How could I feel otherwise? I was the only girl among all my cousins, and so my early life was one of a typical spoiled brat. My mother wanted a beautiful, fat, bouncing boy. In fact, she wanted her sister-in-law's son, who was born around the same time I was. Instead, she got me. Skinny, whining, never eating, hardly sleeping, always crying. Of all my memories, perhaps the most vivid is of being at my grandparents' or in my own house and listening to records played on the Victrola or the radio. About the only time you heard any of us sing was on somebody's birthday, so I suppose it was somewhat surprising that at age 2 I learned the words to every song on the hit parade. One special favorite of mine was Accentuate the Positive, which I would belt out on occasion to the delight of my audience. More than any other song, that one seemed to suit me. And the funny thing is, I think it still fits me today. Despite these impromptu performances reserved for my parents, grandparents, uncles, aunts, and cousins, I was far too shy to be a little ham. In August 1946, my father and mother loaded everything they owned into an old 30-foot-long house trailer, hooked it to the back of Daddy's black 1940 Dodge, placed me and my 9-month-old baby brother Joey in the back seat, and waved our goodbyes. Like so many who had flooded into California right after the war, my parents found themselves someplace well short of paradise. My father arrived in his new home without a job, but as my mother says, we didn't worry. We were happy, we had each other and our 2 babies, and that's all we needed. We lived for a while in a trailer park. Fortunately for my father, good mechanics were in great demand, so there was plenty of work, and before long we moved into our own small house on Fulcher Avenue in North Hollywood, and then to Valley Spring Lane in Studio City. Within just a few years, my parents' faith in their dream was rewarded. Back when we first arrived, L.A. was heavenly. A vast, bright, open city where pastel-colored houses glimmered under graceful palms and richly scented eucalyptus trees. One surprise benefit of the move was that I stopped acting like a brat. No one is sure how or why, but somehow, miraculously, I stopped whining and pouting and became, in the words of my mom, an angel. One thing about me that didn't change, and in fact never would, was my shyness. I was still terribly, almost painfully reserved around strangers. The first day of kindergarten, I was terrified of being left among strangers. I gripped my father so ferociously that I tore some of the buttons off his shirt. Despite being too timid to raise my hand most of the time, I enjoyed and did well in school. Perhaps because of my nervousness, I was always tapping my fingers and toes, so my kindergarten teacher told my mother, "You know, your daughter has rhythm in every bone in her body. When she's dancing, even her little curls fly in time with the song. You should start her playing some kind of percussion instrument." When my mother asked me what I wanted to play, I immediately answered, "Drums." So there I was, skinny little Annette, behind a big drum kit, banging away and loving every minute of it. I adored my music teacher, and before long I was playing drums, xylophone, a huge timpani, anything I could get my hands on. Right down the street from us lived a woman named Margie Ricks, who owned the local dancing school. She remarked to Mom, "Annette needs to get out with other kids, and she needs dancing lessons. Let her come to my dancing class and see if she likes it." After just a single lesson, I was hooked. Every day after school, I used to rush to the dance studio where I studied tap, ballet, modern, hula, everything, and even a little singing. When I wasn't in school or taking dance lessons, I spent my time doing what other kids did, playing, skating, biking. After winning an impromptu poolside beauty contest and being named Miss Willow Lake at age 9, I also did a little modeling. Other than that, my life was utterly normal. My father worked very hard 6 days a week, so every Sunday was set aside for Family Day. After church, the 5 of us, including my baby brother Michael, would spend the rest of the day on a big outing. We might pack a picnic lunch for the beach or go into the mountains to see the snow. Normal sibling spats aside, we were the happiest together. My parents taught us not only to love, but to respect one another, and more importantly, they taught us these things by example. Recalling those times and knowing how my family has stood by me through the years, I can honestly say that I've been blessed, and I'm thankful for that every day. The day I first auditioned for Mr. Disney was unusual for Southern California. Gray, damp, pouring rain. As we drove up to the guardhouse at the Walt Disney Studio entrance on South Buena Vista Street, it didn't appear especially glamorous or at all the way I imagined a studio would be. The 41-acre studio complex in Burbank resembled a bustling college campus more than anything else. Across the lot, I noticed people walking briskly from building to building along wide sidewalks named Mickey Avenue and Dopey Drive. Each of the studio's main buildings was designed in the modern style of the times, with smooth, clear, rounded lines and many windows. Wide expanses of lawn and large shady trees surrounded a movie theater, the commissary, the animation building, and other structures housing the studio's various departments. Toward the back of the complex loomed several tall, cavernous sound stages, including Stage 1, soon to become the home of the Mickey Mouse Club. Mom and I, along with Mr. Gilbert, were ushered into a room where several other children and their parents were waiting. Mom and I sat silently, not to mention nervously, as they chatted with one another, referring to their agents, their contracts, their auditions, all showbiz talk. There were some there, like us, who obviously felt a bit out of their element. I was called back again within a couple of weeks, and the second time, like the first, I performed ballet and tap numbers, and I was also interviewed. With each callback, my prospects brightened. Even then, we were still in the dark about exactly what the Mickey Mouse Club would be. No one mentioned that 23 of the 24 pairs of Mouseketeer ears had already been claimed. It's probably best that I wasn't aware I was competing for the last spot. Then I really would have been nervous. Finally, during the last of the 3 auditions, Mr. Disney said, "Okay now, Annette, I'd like to hear you sing something." Stunned, I barely managed to utter, politely of course, "I'm sorry, Mr. Disney, but I don't sing," in the calming, reassuring manner I would come to know so well. Mr. Disney smiled and replied, "Well, surely you can sing a few notes from one of your favorite songs." "Okay," I answered before taking a deep breath. I sang "That's All I Want From You," that I knew from the radio. Everyone listened attentively, and when I finished, Mr. Disney said simply, "Thank you, Annette." As before, we left the studio not knowing where I stood. The suspense was finally broken when the Disney people phoned shortly thereafter and told my mother that they would give me a 2-week tryout to see if I got along with the other kids. If everything worked out, the studio would put me under contract and make me a Mouseketeer. Within a matter of weeks, I was standing inside Soundstage 1 along with 23 other children. They ranged in age from 9 to 14, each gazing at his or her funny-looking black felt beanie, topped by a pair of big round mouse ears and the circular Mickey Mouse Club insignia. The girls' version came with a dainty bright red satin bow attached. What were these? We all wondered silently. In the 40 years since that day, I have said countless times I owe everything to those ears, and I mean it. Without Mickey Mouse, there would have been no mouse ears, and without the ears, no Mouseketeers. But going back even further, without Mr. Disney, there wouldn't have been so many things we treasure today. In the early 30s, the very idea of an animated feature struck most people in the industry as absurd. First, it had never been done before. Second, because each frame of a cartoon was then drawn by hand, and it took 24 frames to create 1 second of action on screen, well, clearly it would be a lengthy and expensive undertaking. Undaunted, Mr. Disney persevered over nearly 4 years on his first feature-length project, spending 3 times his original $500,000 budget. As the months passed, Hollywood wags began referring to the production, which would ultimately require over 2 million individual drawings, as Disney's folly. When Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs premiered in late 1937, it changed American animation forever, opening the door for the Disney classics that followed. Pinocchio, Fantasia, Dumbo, Bambi, The Three Caballeros, Song of the South, Cinderella, Alice in Wonderland, and Peter Pan. It was an incredible output, and what makes it even more impressive is that it represents only a fraction of the Disney releases from 1940 to 1954. There were other animated shorts and features, as well as live-action films, such as Treasure Island, The Story of Robin Hood, and 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. Although many of these Disney films are remembered for their technical innovations, at the heart of every classic Disney release was a great story. In its way, Mr. Disney's approach was highly sophisticated, and contrary to popular belief, the world portrayed in Disney films was not always one of sweetness and light. Some of the most memorable scenes from the Disney works are also the most heartbreaking. Bambi hearing the gunshot that kills his mother, Dumbo visiting his caged mother, the Seven Dwarfs discovering the dead Snow White, the young master having to shoot his rabid dog Old Yeller. Each of these reflected Mr. Disney's sentimental yet pragmatic philosophy. With every laugh, there must be a tear somewhere. Mickey Mouse is probably Walt Disney's most famous creation, a bright-eyed, energetic, and sympathetic little guy, so sweet and well-meaning and so human, you sometimes forget he's a mouse. Legend has it that Mr. Disney, after a series of disappointing business meetings in New York City, was inspired to create Mortimer Mouse. You heard it right, Mortimer. Renamed Mickey shortly thereafter, the cheerful yet mischievous fellow soon became a celebrity of international renown, counting among his millions of fans President Franklin D. Roosevelt and film star Mary Pickford. As the 50s dawned, Hollywood looked at television and saw the enemy. It was widely believed that television would sound the death knell for the film industry because people would stay at home rather than go out to a movie theater. Few actually understood television's creative potential. One of them was Walt Disney. His initial attempts were 2 popular Christmas specials in 1950 and 1951. By 1954, he was ready to jump in with both feet. That year, he began producing and hosting a weekly hour-long series called Disneyland. At that time, Disneyland, the Magic Kingdom, existed primarily in Mr. Disney's imagination in notes, preliminary drawings, and 160 acres of orange groves in Anaheim. Over the years, the show's title would undergo several changes to Walt Disney Presents, Walt Disney's Wonderful World of Color, The Wonderful World of Disney, Disney's Wonderful World, and finally, simply Walt Disney, before it left the air in 1983. Segments are now aired on the Disney Channel. It remains the longest-running primetime series in television history and is widely acknowledged for bringing movie-quality production values to the small screen. Though television was still in its infancy, there was no lack of children's programming. Some of the most popular elements of early children's shows included adventure shows such as Fury, Space Patrol, Sky King, and puppets as in Howdy Doody and Captain Kangaroo, and audience participation. Who can forget Howdy Doody's famous Peanut Gallery? Programs that took a more educational approach, such as the many quiz shows, and Mr. Wizard also drew viewers. The concept of the Mickey Mouse Club took form over a year. The decision was made to incorporate a number of elements: cartoons, guest stars, special educational features, and music written specifically for the club. Mr. Disney was adamant that the show not talk down to kids. He felt that if it was aimed at 12-year-olds, their younger siblings would naturally start watching. Walt Disney wisely instructed his staff to seek out children who were not professional performers. He felt that children could learn a great deal as they went along. His biggest concern was that the cast be able to get along well through the long days of rehearsing and shooting. For this reason, he avoided children whose parents might be considered stage parents. Once we started working, each child had to be accompanied by a parent or guardian. In almost all cases, it was the mother who remained on the studio lot and was kept away from the set where we rehearsed and filmed. Walt Disney set up the studio's movie theater so that mothers could sit there and watch movies, chat, knit, sew, or read, passing the time however they wanted. Hundreds of children were invited to audition at the studio, most of us being what Mr. Disney described as ordinary kids. It is to Mr. Disney's great credit, I believe, that during the entire 3 years the Mickey Mouse Club was in production, we remained ordinary kids, despite the show's tremendous success. He made sure that we were always having fun. There wasn't a day when he didn't drop by the set to see how things were going, to ask us if we needed anything, to simply say hello. He extended the same courtesy and consideration to our mothers. The 24 hopefuls that were made Mouseketeers ranged in age from 9 to 14 and were divided into 3 separate groups, red, white, and blue. While all the Mouseketeers were used for skits and numbers, the show's openings and closings were performed by members of the Red Group: Sharon Baird, Bobby Burgess, Tommy Cole, Darlene Gillespie, Doreen Tracy, Lonnie Burr, me, Cubby O'Brien, and Karen Pendleton, the so-called Meesketeers because they were just 9 years old and among the youngest. The other Mouseketeers from that first season were Nancy Abbott, Billie Jean Bean Blossom, Dennis Day, Mary Espinoza, Bonnie Lou Kern, Bronson Scott, the youngest Mouseketeer, Mary Sartori, Mark Sutherland, Michael Smith, Don Underhill, Johnny Crawford, Dickie Dodd, Ronnie Steiner, John Lee Johan, Judy Harriet, Paul Peterson, Linda Hughes, and Tim and Mickey Rooney, Jr., the sons of actor Mickey Rooney. Only after I began working at other studios with other producers, directors, and crews did I realize how unique the Disney lot was. Everyone who worked at Disney lived according to the same high moral standards of behavior. We Mouseketeers were told to refer to everyone as Uncle or Aunt, so there was Uncle Walt, of course, although I could never bring myself to call him that. To me, he would always be Mr. Disney. We called our makeup man Uncle Makeup and our hairdresser Aunt Hairdresser. Everyone treated us with kindness, patience, and courtesy. But there is one person whose contributions to the Mickey Mouse Club were particularly important, and that is Jimmy Dodd. Jimmy Dodd became a staff songwriter for Disney shortly before the Mickey Mouse Club began. Previous to that, he had enjoyed a long-respected career as an actor, songwriter, and song and dance man. Although he was in his mid-40s when the Mickey Mouse Club began, Jimmy was very much one of us. He was our leader, both on stage and off. A devoutly religious, friendly, even-tempered man. Jimmy never once raised his voice in anger to anyone. His straightforward approach to giving children advice to grow on is familiar to anyone who watched the show. Jimmy's optimism and enthusiasm, his sense of fair play and cooperation are evident in the many songs he composed for the show, such as the Mickey Mouse Club March. We play fair and we work hard and we're in harmony, from the seldom heard second verse. And beauty is as beauty does. Beauty isn't only looks, it's what you've got inside. At the end of each show, Jimmy looked directly into the camera and spoke to our audience from his heart, often beginning with the words, "May I have a word with you now, Mouseketeers?" He then shared his thoughts on such serious matters as the importance of having a vision or the reasons you shouldn't spread gossip. Jimmy's cohort, our big Mouseketeer, was Roy Williams, an animator and writer who had worked at the studio since Walt Disney hired him at age 18. Roy possessed a wonderful, warm personality that was irresistible. I look back fondly on the good times I spent with all of them. In so many ways, we became a family. After the entire club was selected, we got to work very quickly. Whatever reservations I had about my new career, they were all pretty much forgotten after a couple of weeks on the set. I would wake up every morning ready to go. I couldn't wait to get on the lot to see my friends. It was not all fun and games, though. One of the first things each of us had to do was appear before the State Board of Health. California has very strict laws governing child actors, and we had to meet numerous conditions to remain under contract. For example, we were weighed and interviewed periodically. The Board of Health had to be satisfied that we were getting sufficient rest and eating well. They would ask our parents if we were biting our nails or wetting the bed, both symptoms of overwork and stress. Because I had never been a very good eater, these periodic examinations worried Mom to no end, but I always passed. Long before most people had even heard of the Mickey Mouse Club, my being a Mouseketeer was having a profound impact on my family. Each child's work permit was contingent on a parent or guardian's being on the lot with him or her every minute, every day, 6 days a week, from 9 in the morning until we stopped working around 5 o'clock. At the time, my brother Joey was 9 and my baby brother Michael just 2. My father worked 6 full days a week at his garage on Ventura Boulevard in Sherman Oaks, and sometimes on Sundays. With few close friends and no family to turn to, my mother would drop Michael off to stay with his godmother. Poor Michael cried almost all day long, which broke my mother's heart. Siblings and other children weren't allowed on the lot for insurance reasons, I understand, so she really had no choice. For my mother, who had never let anyone outside our family babysit us, and who was used to being home all the time, this was quite an adjustment. It was clear that if a mother ever got caught leaving the lot during a workday, her child's contract would be canceled immediately. Despite this, my mother and a few others soon figured out ingenious ways to sneak off the lot, even if only for an hour or two. My mother would run home to start dinner or take care of some other tasks. When my father came home, he would finish the preparation, set the table, and have a lovely dinner waiting for us. The mothers covered for one another so nobody would realize anyone had left. It wasn't until many years later that my mother learned that several people we worked with, including the guard at the gate, knew full well what was going on, but kept it to themselves. The state was especially strict when it came to our education. Usually the schedule called for 4 hours of work on the set, 3 hours for school, and an hour for lunch and breaks. Our tutor, Mrs. Jean Seaman, was a great teacher whom I admired and still consider a very good friend. Our classrooms were 2 little red mobile trailers on the studio lot. Whenever we traveled, one accompanied us, and we continued our lessons no matter where we were. While one group of Mouseketeers was rehearsing a new number or filming, the second would be in class. You had to get in your 3 hours of school each day however you could, sometimes in 20-minute bursts. In addition, we all had homework to do every day. Now looking back, this all seems like quite a load for a bunch of kids, but we didn't mind. Before the Mickey Mouse Club TV program debuted in October 1955, we Mouseketeers were publicly introduced at the grand opening of Disneyland that summer. Just imagine being one of the first children to set foot in Disneyland. It was one of the most awe-inspiring experiences of my life. To really appreciate what it was like for us, you have to remember that a theme park of that type and size Mr. Disney envisioned simply didn't exist. There had long been amusement parks and carnivals with rides, games, and entertainment, but traveling across much of America, Mr. Disney saw the same thing over and over: amusement parks that were poorly planned, inadequately maintained, and unattractive. In Disneyland, Mr. Disney sought to create a clean, attractive, safe environment for children and their parents. He so deeply believed in his dream that he borrowed money against his life insurance policies and sold one of his homes to finance it. Disneyland would be a self-contained 62-acre universe made up of several main attractions. Frontierland, Fantasyland, Tomorrowland, and Adventureland were filled with rides, amusements, and exhibits that were both educational and fun. A large part of Disneyland's appeal to Mr. Disney was that it would be a living thing, something he could change or improve or add to through the years. For a man like Mr. Disney, who avidly followed new developments in science and technology, Disneyland was a great playground. From beginning to end, no detail, not even the design of the garbage cans, escaped his scrutiny. Disneyland opened to an invited audience on Sunday, July 17, 1955. Traffic around the site backed up for 10 miles in all directions. The opening ceremonies were broadcast live across America in a television special hosted by Bob Cummings, Ronald Reagan, then working as an actor, and Art Linkletter. In addition to the 15,000 invited guests, among them such celebrities as Frank Sinatra, Danny Thomas, Don DeFore, Sammy Davis Jr., and their children, many thousands more gained admittance with counterfeit tickets. Under the crush of 33,000 visitors, food and beverage concessions quickly ran out, and some public facilities broke down. In the middle of Main Street, Mr. Disney opened his dream park with the following dedication. To all who come here to this happy place, welcome. Disneyland is your land. Here, age relives fond memories of the past, and here youth may savor the challenge and promise of the future. Disneyland is dedicated to the ideals, the dreams, and the hard facts that have created America, with the hope that it will be a source of joy and inspiration to all the world. Thank you. An American flag was raised, and the U.S. Marine Band played the Star-Spangled Banner. Then the Air National Guard flew overhead as the parade down Main Street began. When we appeared, Bob Cummings announced us as the performing children. Neither he nor Art Linkletter seemed quite sure who or what a Mouseketeer was. After us came Fess Parker and Buddy Epson, who played Davy Crockett and his sidekick George Russell in the popular TV series. Then came Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, Cinderella, Annie Oakley, and countless other characters from history, legend, and storybooks. As the ceremonies continued, 29 television cameras took viewers from one area of the park to the other. Finally, in Fantasyland, we performed the theme from Talent Roundup Day. Saddle your pony, here we go, down to the Talent Rodeo, followed by a pretty hot swing-style number. For the first time ever, America heard and saw Jimmy Dodd announce, Mouseketeer roll call, count off now, and we marched in line toward the camera and said our names. During the number, Bob Cummings predicted, I guarantee that many a future star will come out of this group. For the tens of millions of children who became the Mickey Mouse Club's first fans, growing up was much easier than it is now. If you watch the show today, you might think of it as very much a product of a time that is generally dismissed as being too sedate, even boring. For example, the show's individual segments seem quaintly long compared to the current quick edit style, and the innocent messages sound a little too goody-goody. But while the Mickey Mouse Club may appear an idealization, it was, in fact, an honest, if exaggerated, reflection of an America that, sadly, has faded into history. To some, the 50s were a decade marked by the banal, the predictable, and yet that Eisenhower decade was a time of dizzying progress. The vaccine for polio, a crippling, sometimes fatal illness that parents dreaded for decades, was finally made available. The first advances in civil rights were being made. IBM sold its first business computer. Ann Landers published her first advice column, and ever so slowly, rock and roll came into our lives. Kids as young as I was then thrilled to James Dean's romantic, misunderstood teen in Rebel Without a Cause. To have been a child then was to feel a part of a fantastic age of promise and wonder, and to take for granted a future of optimism and security. Defining and capturing that time forever was television. It showed us how to see the world and ourselves, and through its programming, it shaped both. At the beginning of 1955, only about 60% of American homes had TVs, but that number would increase dramatically during the next 3 years. To understand the phenomenon of a children's program like the Mickey Mouse Club, or the sentimental affection and nostalgia adults still feel for the club and other popular children's shows, such as Captain Kangaroo and Howdy Doody. It's important to understand that watching television in those days, for those kids, was not the same experience it is today. It's difficult to grasp the sense of anticipation, the thrill that sitting before it inspired then. After years of listening to radio, we found the black and white images mesmerizing right down to the Indian chief test pattern. For the first time in history, you could have a theater right near home. It was in this world now long past that the Mickey Mouse Club premiered on Monday, October 3rd, 1955. We had taped some of the segments as early as the previous May. In its first Nielsen ratings period, only the historic World Series pitting the Brooklyn Dodgers against the New York Yankees drew more viewers than the Mickey Mouse Club. Within just a few weeks, ours was the top-rated children's program and would remain so throughout its four-season run. For those of you who never saw the Mickey Mouse Club, or perhaps haven't seen it in many years, I'll try to describe what it was all about. After the rousing opening march, Mickey Mouse appeared on the stage dressed in the appropriate costume for the day. Each day of the week was special. On Monday we had fun with music. Tuesday we rolled out the carpet for Guest Star Day. On Wednesday anything could happen. Thursday was Circus Day. And on Friday we opened the Dry Gulch Corral to the Talent Roundup. For Guest Star Day, Mickey, resplendent in tails on his evening jacket, of course, played A Dream is a Wish Your Heart Makes on a grand piano. On Fridays, he entered shooting in a cowboy hat and chaps. Each day of the week had its own special opening number, always ending with Jimmy calling out, "Mouseketeer roll call, count off now," except on Friday when he addressed us as his Mouska partners. Throughout the week, we presented a number of other popular features. The first half hour usually included a newsreel featuring brief reports on events and trends everywhere in the world, from Palm Beach, Florida to Nagasaki. Other educational series took viewers behind the scenes, for example, at the FBI to learn about fingerprinting or to a government mint to see how money is made. Special reports included a trip to the San Diego Zoo with a professional photographer from Look magazine who showed several Mouseketeers how to take interesting photographs, and an inside look at the then-booming world of quarter-scale miniature hot rod racing. Jiminy Cricket provided another educational part of the show as our guide through the encyclopedia. All over the country, tiny kids amazed adults with their ability to spell after hearing Jiminy sing ENCYCLOPEDIA a few times. Every day, one or several of us Mouseketeers stood before the Mickey Mouse Club treasure mine and chanted these magical words, "Miska, Muska, Mouseketeer, Mouse cartoon time now is here." And voila, a cartoon. All drawn from the Disney Studios' vast cartoon archives, these animated shorts included, obviously, Mickey Mouse, Minnie Mouse, Pluto, Goofy, Donald Duck, and the gang, as well as vintage classics such as the Academy Award-winning Ferdinand the Bull. The show's second half was dedicated to the day's theme, and it was then that you could see how the Mickey Mouse Club really stood ears and shoulders above the competition. Our sets, costumes, musical numbers, and skits were lavish and unusual, yet done with just a touch of whimsy. I love something about every day, but I think the segments I most look forward to were on guest star day. Of all the many memorable guests we welcomed to the Mickey Mouse Club, my absolute favorites were the Lennon sisters. I idolized Diane, Peggy, Kathy, and Janet. They sang beautifully, and what made them so appealing to me was that they were around my age, ranging from about 9 to 16, and so beautiful and glamorous. One of the interesting facts about the Mickey Mouse Club is that virtually all the music used on it, from the Mickey Mouse Club March, which opened the show, to the closing Mickey Mouse Club theme, "Now it's time to say goodbye to all our company," was written specifically for the program. In all, over 50 songwriters and composers contributed to the 360 episodes of the Mickey Mouse Club produced between 1955 and 1958. In our special costumes and ears, we Mouseketeers appeared to live in a world of our own, filled with adventure, discovery, and fun. We spoke our own Mouska language. A guitar was a mouse guitar, for example, and we performed a Mouska dance, and our travelogues were Mouska tours. In 1990, I, along with Sharon, Bobby, Tommy, Sherry, and Don, guest starred in the new Mickey Mouse Club's first anniversary show. In one segment, the younger Mouseketeers performed a terrific Mouska send-up of our Mouska prefix Obsession. It looked like a happy little world, and it really was. We were as comfortable and easygoing off-camera as on. Now, I say this knowing that there might be some Mouseketeers out there who would disagree. Certainly, all being kids, a few among us didn't always get along, and we saw our share of spats, but they all blew over, as those things usually do. In fact, I started one of the most enduring friendships of my life with Mouseketeer Sharon Baird. Like me, Sharon was on the red team all 3 seasons. As most Mouska viewers recall, one of the show's most popular segments was the serials. These were really more like feature films cut into 11 or 12-minute episodes that were shown daily. The early serials included The Adventures of Spin and Marty, Corky and White Shadow starring Darlene Gillespie, and the Hardy Boys serials with Tim Considine and Tommy Kirk, who I later worked with in 6 Disney films. On the studio lot, we Mouseketeers were just doing our jobs and were treated like kids, not stars. Outside the gates on South Buena Vista Street, however, things for us really started to change. Aside from the ratings, the first evidence of Mouskamania was the great success of anything related to the Mickey Mouse Club. For a while, brand-new mouse-eared beanies were being sold at the rate of 24,000 a day. Soon, Mr. Disney, a pioneer in the field of merchandising, authorized the manufacture of over 200 Mickey Mouse Club products, such as the famous $4 Mattel-produced mouse guitar. One day, Mr. Disney stopped by the set and called me aside. "Annette," he said, "you must have an awful lot of relatives back east, because you're getting more fan mail than anyone else." The full force of the Mickey Mouse Club phenomenon didn't truly sink in until we started making personal appearances. At first, we usually worked on the show 5 days a week and then spent the weekend and most of the summer performing at Disneyland. At the Disneyland Circus, we Mouseketeers performed an aerial ballet trapeze act 5 times a day. It was really spectacular and I thought glamorous. While we knew that 3/4 of all TV sets in America were tuned into our show each day, the real meaning of these numbers didn't register. It was hard to imagine 10 million people loving what you did. The true magnitude of Mouseketeerdom came into sharp focus through the windows of our tour bus. The show became so popular that we members of the Red Group made a number of road trips across the country and performed live. As always, our mothers, a great staff from Disney, and a tutor accompanied us. In town after town, we saw hundreds, sometimes thousands of kids and adults lined up, cheering us on as we rode by. The Mouseketeers played anywhere and everywhere, it seemed. School gymnasiums, local TV and radio stations, theaters and arenas, county and state fairs. Each Mouseketeer performed his or her specialty, and for me, that was ballet. Wherever we traveled, Mr. Disney always felt that we had an obligation to visit and perform for disadvantaged and hospitalized children. These visits are still vivid to me, from the disinfectant smell of the hospitals to the squeaky sounds our shoes made on the polished floors. And the expressions on these little kids' faces, your heart would just break. The show changed very little during its original run. The format remained fairly consistent except for the fact that in our third season, 57 to 58, the length was cut down from 1 hour to half an hour daily. I suppose the only thing that wasn't going to remain exactly the same was us, the Mouseketeers. We were beginning to grow up. The trials and tribulations of growing up were frequently the serial's underlying theme. My next job in a serial was playing Spin's girlfriend in the second installment of the popular Spin and Marty serials. I appeared in both the Further Adventures of Spin and Marty and the New Adventures of Spin and Marty, playing Annette, a camper from the girls' camp across the lake, the Circle H Ranch. My character's relationship with Spin would bloom into sweet but of course chaste romance. One bit of dialogue seemed to portend my many on-screen persona for years to come. As Spin and Annette sat together, he observed, "It's a funny deal getting married." "Well, I think it's nice," Annette retorts. The serial that I'm most closely associated with, however, is Annette, which began running on February 10th, 1958, toward the end of our last original season. The 1958-59 season, which was part of the first run of the show, was made up of edited reruns from the 55-56 and 56-57 seasons. Annette's 21 episodes told the story of Annette McLeod, a teenage girl who is orphaned after the death of her father. Then she leaves her country home in Beaver Junction, Nebraska, to live with her wealthy Uncle Archie and Aunt Lila. One of the best parts about the Annette serial was that it gave me the chance to work with so many of my friends. But there's a special place in my heart for one cast member in particular, Shelley Fabre. We first met in 1955 when Shelley, whose aunt is comedienne Annette Fabre, happened to be taking instructions for her confirmation at Blessed Sacrament School in Hollywood. Shortly after that, she was cast in the Annette serial, and over the course of filming, we forged a lifelong friendship. As we grew older, and Shelley became famous in her role as Mary Stone on the Donna Reed Show, we found we understood each other and the problems of youthful stardom better than anyone else we knew. Going through adolescence isn't easy for anyone, and I was as insecure as any young teenager. Though it must sound odd coming from someone whose full adult height is 5'3", as I kept growing, I secretly worried that I'd get fired for being too tall. Among the other Mouseketeers, I already felt that I stood out with my dark curly hair and my Italian features. Some believe this uniqueness made me appear exotic, but like most prepubescents, I despised being different. I had wanted to be like everyone else, to have straight blonde hair that I could wear in pigtails, freckles, blue eyes, and a surname that everyone could pronounce with ease. One day I approached Mr. Disney and announced, "I want to change my name to Annette Turner." Mr. Disney looked at me, obviously surprised and probably a little bit amused, and replied, "Why would you want to change your name, young lady? You have a beautiful name, but you're mispronouncing it. It isn't Funicello, it's Funicello." "But no one can pronounce Funicello," I replied. "How will anyone remember it?" "Young lady," Mr. Disney answered firmly, "once they learn your name, they will never forget it. I promise you." As usual, Mr. Disney was right. One other surprise came from the Annette serial, my recording career. In several episodes, I sing a sweet waltz tempo ballad entitled "How Will I Know My Love?" At first, I was going to lip-sync to another singer's voice, but it was decided that I should try to do it myself. No one thought much about the song, and I thought even less of my singing, the product of what I call a 3-note range. I didn't especially enjoy performing it because, as far as I was concerned, I couldn't carry a tune. Apparently, a lot of people disagreed, because the day after the episode aired, thousands of callers from all over the country wanted to know where they could buy my record. My record? Mr. Disney asked to see me. "I'm signing you to a recording contract," he announced. Upon release in 1958, to my total shock and surprise, How Will I Know My Love sold several 100,000 copies, and my recording career began. Through 1956 and 1957, the Mickey Mouse Club continued to gain viewers. At the same time, Mr. Disney was in the midst of expanding the studio's production of television programs and live-action feature films. For these, he often cast various Mouseketeers and the serial stars. But then there was shocking news. The Mickey Mouse Club was closing its doors. To this day, I still don't know precisely why the Mickey Mouse Club ended when it did. A show that well loved almost certainly could have continued for many more seasons. No doubt several factors led to the cancellation. With all the original music, the hundreds of costumes, and the unusually large staff, the show had proved exceedingly expensive to produce. The ABC network felt that we needed more sponsors, but Mr. Disney disagreed. He was of the opinion that the show contained too many commercials. People are often surprised to learn that our original run was so short. Because the show went immediately into reruns, followed by years of syndication around the world, several generations can claim to have grown up with us, and we Merry Mouseketeers remained, at least through the TV screen, eternally young. Oh, you can imagine the shock and sadness when we were told toward the end of 1957 that we'd be shooting the Mickey Mouse Club for only 3 more months. This was my family away from home, and I felt I was losing much more than a job. The Mickey Mouse Club had brought me so much happiness. From my years there, I learned the satisfaction of doing what I love, how to feel at least somewhat comfortable around new people, and learning the true meaning of friendship. It seemed to me and to some of the other kids that a wonderful part of our lives was being wrenched away. All through the final Friday of shooting, I wept until I was sure there were no more tears left. But there were. All of us Mouseketeers cried, and so did our mothers. Making it even more difficult was that last day's work. We were filming reaction shots in which we all had to laugh and smile as if we were the happiest kids on earth. Now that took acting. Now it's time to say goodbye. At that moment, I would have given anything just to stay there forever. Turning to leave the Mickey Mouse Club set for the last time, I felt as if I couldn't bear it. When would I see my friends again, and Jimmy and Roy? If I could have seen into the future, I'd have found comfort knowing that the promise of our closing theme would hold true. Through the years, we'll all be friends, wherever we may be. Most of our friendships did continue and grow over the next 4 decades. Our mothers remained friends, and our fans have yet to forget us. At the time, however, it was just the end. In the midst of goodbyes and the teary hugs, Mom and I felt somewhat uncomfortable. Sometime before this, one of Mr. Disney's associates had called me aside and said, "Annette, we have to talk about something very important." My first reaction was total panic as I thought, this is finally it. They're finally going to fire me for growing too tall. Instead, in a later meeting, Mom and I were told that Mr. Disney wanted me to stay under contract to the studio after the Mickey Mouse Club ended. They also told us that I was the only Mouseketeer who would be staying. You know, it still strikes me as ironic that of the 24 kids on the show, I, the shyest and arguably the least interested in a show business career, was chosen to continue working for the Walt Disney Studio. I've often been asked why Mr. Disney kept only me, and I honestly don't know. Now more than ever, the lot became my second home. The Walt Disney Studio was always a friendly place, and over the years, Mom and I had come to know just about everyone by his or her first name. Being 15 and a half and finally able to have a normal adolescence, I'm pretty sure I'd have retired had I not been able to remain at the Disney Studio, where I felt comfortable and secure. In August, I began work on my first feature film and Disney's first live-action comedy, The Shaggy Dog. It seemed just like Old Home Week. Among the other young actors were Kevin Corcoran and Tim Considine, whom I had worked with on the Spin and Marty serials, Roberta Shore, who was in Annette, and Tommy Kirk. The biggest thrill, of course, was meeting and working with such established Hollywood stars as Gene Hagen and Fred MacMurray. If you blinked twice during the film, you probably missed me. I played Allison D'Alisi, Buzz's girlfriend, who, naturally, is offended when he displays undisguised interest in the sexy little French-speaking girl Francesca, who moves in next door. This was probably one of the first times I got to use my pout, which would come in so handy later when Merlin Jones and Frankie eyed other girls. Just days after we completed filming, I was back in the red schoolhouse trailer studying with Mrs. Seaman. Mr. Disney walked in, smiled, and handed me a script. "Happy Sweet 16, Annette. You're appearing in Zorro." "Zorro?" Surprised, grateful, stunned, thrilled to death, I was practically speechless. Being famous didn't in any way hamper my being a typical teenage girl when it came to boys, or in this case, men. I must have had a million crushes, all quite innocent, but none as all-consuming as the one I had on Guy Williams, who played Zorro. As Zorro, a black-masked caped avenger whose secret identity was known only to his servant Bernardo, played by Gene Sheldon, he pursued villains astride one of his stallions, Tornado or Phantom. Then he dispatched them with a lash of his whip or a thrust of his sword. Each episode opened with the mark of Zorro, the letter Z, carved in 3 lightning-quick sword strokes. In a 3-episode story that first aired in early 1959, I played Ania Cabrillo, a young Spanish girl who comes to Los Angeles in search of her father. In 1961, I returned to Zorro in an episode entitled The Postponed Wedding. I even wielded Zorro's sword, thrusting it into the chest of my no-good fiancé and sending him plunging off the side of the ship, if you can imagine that. Next, Mr. Disney cast me as Chiquita Bernal, another troubled senorita in Attorney-at-Law and the Griswold Murder, parts 5 and 6 of the 9 Lives of El Fego Baca. El Fego Baca was based on a true story of a Tombstone, Arizona gunslinger turned sheriff turned attorney who holds tenaciously to the then revolutionary belief that disputes should be settled through the law, not with guns. As El Fego tells a disbelieving deputy sheriff who turns out to be corrupt, sooner or later a man learns that a gun never ends a problem, only a life. If only children's television could be this good today. Within weeks of completing Zorro and El Fego Baca, I was loaned out, that is, permitted to work on a non-Disney production. Since I was under exclusive contract to Disney, any producer who wished to hire me had to obtain Mr. Disney's personal permission. He also had full script approval on any outside project I was involved in. The minute I set foot on the set of the popular series Make Room for Daddy, it was clear that everyone who worked for Danny Thomas, cast and crew alike, adored him. This was especially true of Rusty Hamer, who played his wisecracking son and whom Danny treated like a son off-camera as well. Unfortunately, Rusty's later life was not as happy. In 1990, at the age of 42, he committed suicide. Although Danny worked very hard and demanded perfection, no one complained. Offstage, Danny Thomas was very much like the character he played, aggressive, gruff, plain-spoken, and volatile. Yet I also saw a man of great intelligence, sensitivity, and kindness. Filming those episodes was one of the happiest experiences of my career. One reason for Make Room for Daddy's immense popularity and why it holds up so well today is that the Williams family was much more realistic than many other TV families. Danny yelled at the kids, his wife Kathy gently ridiculed him, and little Linda and Rusty talked back. In January of 1959, Disneyland Records released my first pop single and my first top 10 hit, Tall Paul. Rather than return to the sweet ballad style of How Will I Know My Love, Mr. Disney and my producer, Tutti Camarata, decided to aim my next record squarely at the rock and roll market, which in just a few years had exploded beyond everyone's expectations. Tall Paul and my subsequent hits were rock and roll, but without the edge. These were fun records, sweet and bouncy or softly sentimental. At the time, young, clean-cut performers like the Everly Brothers, Frankie Avalon, Paul Anka, and Pat Boone were flying to the top of the charts with songs that celebrated the innocent, romantic yearnings of young love. The late 50s and early 60s marked the heyday of the teen idol. Handsome, romantic, gentlemanly Frankie, Paul, and the others were boys you could dream of falling in love with and introducing to your parents. Except for Connie Francis and a couple of other girls, there were few young female rock stars. In my own way, I suppose, I was the girl version of a teen idol. Wholesome, perky, a good girl. The right song came to me through pure happy luck. One day in 1958, two songwriting brothers, Robert and Richard Sherman, decided to put a twist on an age-old pop song convention. It seemed to them that there had been plenty of guys singing to and about their girls. Buddy Holly's Peggy Sue, Paul Anka's Diana, Little Richard's Lucille, the Everly Brothers' Claudette, and countless others. What about a song that a girl could sing about her guy, they asked. With that idea in mind, the Sherman Boys, as we always called them, worked furiously and in 2 hours finished Tall Paul. When it was first recorded by Judy Harriet, coincidentally another Mouseketeer, Tall Paul was not a hit. But someone from Disney happened to hear it played on a New Jersey radio station and brought it to Mr. Disney's attention. Everyone agreed that Tall Paul fit me perfectly. The simple, heavily accentuated lyrics, chalk on the sidewalk, writing on the wall, everybody knows that I love Paul, had the playful bounce of rhymes kids recite while jumping rope. With the Sherman Boys and Tootie behind me in the studio, I was relaxed and confident. In March 1959, Tall Paul had reached number 7 on the Billboard chart. Over the next 5 years, the Shermans wrote 35 more songs for me, but their contribution to my singing career did not end with writing songs. While we were recording Tall Paul, the boys and Tootie came up with the idea of double-tracking my voice and adding echo. In the studio, I sang along to a playback of the instrumental tracks. Then I sang my parts again to a playback that included my first vocal take. With the added echo, my little voice suddenly had a distinct presence, wide-eyed, energetic, unerringly sweet, and the so-called Annette sound was born. From an unknown little would-be ballerina, little more than 3 years before, I'd become a celebrity. Fan and movie magazines portrayed me as the Queen of Teen, a girlfriend next door who just happened to be a famous, successful actress and recording star. I was the notable exception among other young actresses who, at least allegedly, were conducting torrid love affairs and running away from home. I was just a happy, well-adjusted, normal teenager, and it was all basically true. While many young actresses of the time moved away from home early and became involved in numerous love affairs, I lived happily with my parents and my brothers Joey and Michael until I married. I came home from work each day, sat down to dinner, and helped my parents with the dishes. I also did my homework, talked on the phone, or had a friend over. Despite my apparent success, my family hadn't exactly become rich from it. My father still worked 5 days a week at his gas station, and we still did all our own housework. Family always came first, as I still believe it should. Perhaps being such an apparent anomaly on the Hollywood scene added to my appeal. Here I was, in movies and on the cover of magazines, yet forbidden to wear black until I turned 18 or to wear eye makeup except on special occasions. My parents didn't allow me to date until I was 16, and even then I observed a strict curfew. With the top 10 success of Tall Paul, a whole new world opened up to me. Sure, having hit records was exciting, but to tell you the truth, I have a special fondness for this part of my career for more personal reasons. Unlike the movies or television work I did after the Mickey Mouse Club, music brought me into a world of people my own age. Some of them, like Frankie Avalon, became dear lifelong friends. And then there was my first true, albeit puppy love, Paul Anka. My first hit launched my career into a new orbit, one that often spun around another good friend, Dick Clark. During the years when I made most of my records, rock and roll was still a new and predominantly American phenomenon. In the late 50s, rock and roll still met a lot of resistance and had its share of sworn enemies. Thousands of concerned citizens, police chiefs, and religious leaders called rock and roll garbage and blamed it for everything from rising juvenile delinquency to the then imminent communist takeover. When Bill Haley and the Comets' first big hit, Rock Around the Clock, played over the opening credits of the film Blackboard Jungle in 1955, the connection between rock and all forms of teen misbehavior seemed set. When the record became the first rock and roll song to hit #1, the rock era began. I absolutely loved rock and roll. In fact, I still do. Today, it's not unusual to find me humming a Black Crowes or Guns N' Roses tune. Back then, of course, things were a little tamer, but my radio was on constantly. My record collection grew weekly as I ran to the record store to scoop up all the latest hits. Pat Boone, Connie Francis, Tommy Sands, Duane Eddy, the Everly Brothers, Johnny Mathis, Ricky Nelson, these were my idols. Rock and roll seemed to be everywhere, but nowhere was it more evident, more alive, and more enticing than on Dick Clark's American Bandstand. For an hour and a half every weekday afternoon, host Dick Clark transported millions of viewers from around the country into a Philadelphia TV studio. Dozens of teens danced and clapped, bopped and strolled, held hands, rated records, and screamed for the guest star idols. Without intending to do so, Dick Clark proved to parents and doubters everywhere that good, clean-cut kids could enjoy rock and roll and still be good kids. When Dick Clark invited me on the show to do Tall Paul, I was thrilled beyond words and nervous. I looked forward to meeting him, but I began worrying about my hands. Yes, my hands. You see, from watching American Bandstand, I knew that after you lip-synced your number, Dick came on stage, greeted you, and shook your hand. Whenever I began feeling nervous, my hands got cold and clammy. The thought of Dick Clark approaching me and then reaching out to hold what felt like a wet fish drove me crazy. I had to do something, and I did. From the first time I appeared on his show, and for some years to come, I never went anywhere without my gloves. Without intending to, I launched a brief fashion craze, and within a few months I had a pair of gloves dyed to match every outfit in my closet. It's funny how one thing leads to another. For example, I first met Dick Clark when I was asked to perform at a concert held in his honor at the Hollywood Bowl. A Salute to Dick Clark was the first rock and roll show ever to be held at the Hollywood Bowl, a venue usually claimed by symphony orchestras. Also on the bill that night were Frankie Avalon, Bobby Darin, Freddie Cannon, Duane Eddy, and other rock stars. It was a wonderful evening and one of the first times I performed any of my records live. To look out into the night and see over 18,000 screaming kids took my breath away. The Hollywood Bowl concert holds a special place in my heart for another reason. It was around that time that I met one of my best buddies for life, Frankie Avalon. Frankie's career had recently shifted into high gear, and as one of his biggest fans, I owned copies of all his hits. Dee Dee Dinah, You Excite Me, Gingerbread, What a Little Girl, I'll Wait for You, and naturally, the #1 single that was just about to peak on the charts when we first met, Venus. At this point, I also had a big crush on him, too. Soon after we met, a little romance sparked, but it was kid stuff. What I loved about Frankie, his kindness, his sincerity, his terrific sense of humor, were traits that also make for a great friendship, and that is what our relationship soon became and has remained. Today we are older and wiser, or so we like to think. In fact, today Frankie is a grandfather. Not surprisingly, the teen magazines in 1959 absolutely ate our relationship up, and for the first time coined the now immortal term Annette and Frankie, or Frankie and Annette. It would be several years before we filmed our first beach party movie together. Looking back, I can see that we must have been destined to be together, if not romantically, then certainly the way we are now. Back in the late 50s, there were really 4 major teen idols, Ricky Nelson, Frankie, Fabian, and Paul Anka. Ricky and I had crossed paths a couple of times, and while he was endearingly sweet, he was also extremely, almost painfully shy. Frankie's friend Fabian was just entering the charts with his very suggestive, I'm a Man. Frankie himself was cute in a sort of young Frank Sinatra way. You know, clean cut, sweet. Fabian, however, was something else. Sexy. It was an image his records like I'm a Man, Turn Me Loose, and Tiger Man drove home with a vengeance. His wearing skin-tight pants didn't hurt either. Fabian soon replaced Guy Williams as my biggest crush. Fabian and I dated briefly, but a big romance wasn't in the cards for Fabe and me. And then there was Paul. You would think that with all the traveling we both did promoting our records, Paul and I would have met somewhere on the road, but we hadn't. Paul's manager, Irvin Feld, happened to be a friend of some friends of my parents. When he asked if Paul could meet me, my parents agreed and a dinner was arranged. I liked Paul well enough, but at first I didn't sense that kind of attraction I'd felt for Frankie or Fabian. He was unlike any boy I'd ever met. Though handsome and charming, and it goes without saying, I suppose, the idol of millions, his attitude toward his career and life in general was more intense, more serious than that of most men his age. Not only was Paul just 16 when he made his first record, but he wrote most of his own songs, a real rarity in those days. Paul, like Bobby Darin, wanted to transcend the teen genre and be taken seriously as more than a teenage crooner. Judging from his astounding success, I think it's safe to say that Paul's dream did come true. He's composed hundreds of songs, including Buddy Holly's It Don't Matter Anymore, the English lyrics to Frank Sinatra's My Way, Tom Jones' She's a Lady, the theme from The Tonight Show, and movie scores, as well as his own hits running from 1957's Diana to his 1974 #1 hit, Havin' My Baby. Initially, Paul's no-nonsense attitude didn't appeal to me. I was used to guys who wanted to have fun, maybe go out for pizza or to a show. Paul, in contrast, wanted to talk about things, important, serious things. In fact, we sort of fell in love over the phone during several of the hundreds of 3-hour-long late-night conversations we shared over the next few years. My romance with Paul really bloomed when we were both booked on Dick Clark's Caravan of Stars tour in the summer of 1959. By then I had released several more singles and had a couple of more modest hits, including Jojo the Dog-Faced Boy and a somber, all-electric version of Jimmy Dodd's Lonely Guitar. Neither of them went top 10, but I took it in stride, knowing how unpredictable the business could be. Night after night, for 6 long weeks, we traveled across the country doing 1, sometimes 2 shows at each stop. Difficult, grueling, exhausting, the Caravan of Stars was an experience few performers, not even Dick himself, look back upon with fondness. However, that tour brought me out into the world and, in a sense, out of my shell. Caravan of Stars conjures up quite a romantic image. A long train of buses and cars filled with happy stars traveling merrily from town to town. Ha! The caravan was actually one bus that seated about 30. And when I say seated, I should probably add slept, too, since on the nights when time was very tight, the performers dozed fitfully as the bus careened through the darkness to the next town. The star-studded roster for Dick's first Caravan of Stars was a who's who of rock. The great R&B singer Laverne Baker, the Drifters, Bobby Rydell, Duane Eddy, Paul Anka, Jimmy Clanton, the Coasters, the Jordan Brothers, Phil Phillips, Lloyd Price, the Skyliners, and others. The Caravan of Stars and large package tours like it were important not only because they brought rock and roll performers to high school auditoriums, state fairs, civic centers, and other venues all over the nation, but in some places they presented the first really integrated bill most folks had ever seen. As I said before, it was on this tour that Paul and I realized we were falling for each other, and we fell hard. At least I know I did. Along with Mr. Disney, Tutti Camarata, and a few others, Paul was one of my biggest boosters. At the time of the tour, I had only 2 hits, Tall Paul and the flip side, Ma, He's Making Eyes at Me. Usually I finished with Tall Paul, and I would sing the last line, Tall Paul, he's my all. Then I would quickly mutter thank you into the microphone and absolutely flee from the stage. One night, Paul was standing in the wings as I came off, and he gently grabbed my arm and said, Annette, my God, you can't just run off the stage like that. You have to have some stage presence. First, after you finish your song, you have to wait for the applause to die down. Then you bow and calmly and slowly say, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, and walk off leisurely. You look like you can't wait to get off that stage. Slowly but surely, I got the hang of actually standing there calmly and smiling at the cheering crowd without bolting. But there were some aspects of my stage presence, if that's what you want to call it, that took some work. I was positively mortified every time something embarrassing happened on stage. For example, when you first came out on stage, the big old-fashioned silver microphone was in its stand, and the first thing you did was walk over and casually remove it from the stand and start your number. I can't tell you how many times in my attempts to appear calm and professional, I jerked the microphone out of the stand and hit myself in the head with it. Or the times I tripped over the microphone wires as I tried to stroll casually across the stage as I sang. I was just a fish out of water, and as much as Paul and others tried to help me, and as much as I improved as the tour wore on, it would be many years before I could comfortably sing live. Through it all, though, Paul really believed in me. One of the enduring results of that faith was my third album, Annette Sings Anka. It was while we were appearing at the Carter Barron Amphitheater in Washington, D.C., that Paul approached Tutti Camarata and told him he'd written a song for me. Tutti was so impressed that he encouraged Paul to go ahead and write a whole album for me. Recorded later that year and released in 1960, Annette Sings Anka remains my personal favorite and my highest charting album. Paul spent a lot of time with me and my family, and he and I passed away many happy hours sitting at the piano bench while he worked on songs or helped me with my singing. Sometimes we tried to come up with songs together, which is where Teddy came from. Puppy Love was one of many songs Paul wrote in my parents' living room. One day I was sitting next to Paul, feeling comfortable and in love. I moved closer and rested my head on his shoulder as Paul started picking out a melody on the keys. Then he sang so softly, "Put your head on my shoulder, hold me in your arms." Well, you know the rest. My relationship with Paul continued on and off over the next couple of years. Of course, when you're in your teens, you don't always know what real love is. Are you truly in love or just infatuated? But does it matter? As Paul wrote in his hit song about us, just because we're 17 didn't mean that for us our love wasn't real. A lot of the problems Paul and I faced could be traced directly to the fact that both of us were in the grips of our respective careers. After a while, it became clear that Paul was much more worldly and mature than I was. At times, impatient and moody, Paul often seemed the polar opposite of me, with my usually happy-go-lucky outlook. Another problem was that in my teenage heart of hearts, I longed for the everyday relationships that other girls my age had. With a boy who lived in the neighborhood, whom I could see after school and go out on dates with. Ironically, thousands of girls would have traded all of that for one date with Paul. I did see boys from my neighborhood from time to time, but these simple things were impossible with Paul. We rarely ventured out together on a date for fear of being recognized and sometimes mobbed. Usually, when Mom and I traveled, we shared one room and bath. There were no suites, no extra sitting room areas. When she felt Paul and I should be alone, Mom generously volunteered to sit in the bathroom on its most comfortable piece of furniture, an empty tub, and read so that Paul and I could visit and listen to records on the portable hi-fi Tutti Camarata gave me. As time passed and our careers tore us from each other more often, jealousy and suspicion crept in. I dated other boys, but very casually. I truly did love Paul, but I think that because I was so much less mature than he was, he simply didn't believe me. Once, when I told Paul that I really did care for him, he sarcastically retorted, "What script did you get that line from?" He quickly apologized, but I was devastated. No one I loved had ever hurt me so deeply. Although we dated several times afterward and remained very close friends, we faced the fact that all the love songs aside, there were some things even true love cannot overcome. After the Caravan of Stars tour ended, I still traveled to make appearances and do Dick Clark shows as well as other television programs. But much of the time, I was back where I always longed to be, home with my family. Growing up is never easy, and growing up in public is especially hard sometimes. For someone as reserved as I was, it wasn't always easy to pick up a magazine and read references to my newly blossoming figure. Mr. Disney preferred that I didn't discuss my measurements, and I was happy to oblige him. It was certainly nice to be noticed for having a good figure, but sometimes the amount of attention mine received seemed, pardon me, out of proportion. Even today, when people, especially men, attribute my popularity as a Mouseketeer to my developing bust line, I feel compelled to point out that I was still fairly flat-chested then. There were other girl Mouseketeers as curvaceous, and I use that term loosely, as I was, but of course I don't. I made no films in 1959, instead concentrating on my recording career. In early 1960, First Name Initial, another of the Sherman Boys' vibrant pop tunes, went to number 20 on the charts. Then later that spring, my second highest charting single, O Dio Mio, hit number 10. After a few cool months, my record seemed to be on a winning streak. Just the month before, Annette Sings Anka, my most popular album, was high on the charts as well. Later that year, the Sherman Brothers and Tutti Camarata started work on the first of the 3 Annette theme albums, Hawaiianette, which led to Italianette, and Danceanette. Hawaiianette, the most successful of this conceptual trilogy, mixed traditional Hawaiian musical fare such as Aloha Oi and Song of the Islands, with the Shermans' own genre-blending compositions like Luau Cha-Cha-Cha, and my last top 20 hit, Pineapple Princess, my personal favorite. A rare rock and roll showcase of ukulele and steel guitar, Pineapple Princess boasts that sweet mix of romance and whimsy that marked so many of the Sherman songs. In 1961, Mom and I flew to England, where I filmed The Horsemasters, a movie that was released in theaters in England and Europe and shown in 2 parts on Walt Disney's Wonderful World of Color. The experience of making The Horsemasters was a series of firsts for me. It was my first co-starring role, my first dramatic film, and my first time filming outside the country. I had always loved horses. In fact, for my 18th birthday, my parents purchased an inexpensive racehorse we named Troy Hedgewood, who raced at Hollywood Park. Because in the film I played the daughter of an Olympic horsewoman, I had to train very hard so that I could ride in the English style like a horsemaster, and that took some doing. I returned to the Disney lot to film my last Zorro episode, The Postponed Wedding. It was so great to be back among my friends. Here it was nearly 6 years since I'd first stepped through the gates on South Buena Vista Street, and I waved hello to the same guards, workmen, gardeners, directors, and crew I'd known from the start. One day, Mr. Disney and I were chatting. He said, "Annette, I'd like you to go over to the hairdressing department." "Why?" I asked. "Let's see how you look as a redhead," was all the explanation he offered, and off he went. There they tinted my hair repeatedly until they got the exact warm cinnamon tone they were looking for. Then they called Mr. Disney to come over and see me. Pleased with the results, he said, "Okay, let's take some photographs and see how Annette'll look." After he saw the finished shots, that was it. I was to play Mary, Mary, quite contrary in the musical Babes in Toyland. Of all my filmmaking experiences, Babes in Toyland is, without question, my favorite. It was one of those rare times when everything about making this film, from my director, my co-stars, the crew, the costumes, even the scenery, was perfect. From the costumes, which included lemon-colored tutus for the chorus, to the lavishly constructed sets. Every scene from Babes in Toyland resembled a beautifully illustrated page from a child's favorite book come to life. My costumes, such as the now famous ermine-trimmed red velvet cape and a stunning pearl and lace-covered wedding gown, were the stuff of fantasy. These weren't clothes. They were hand-embroidered silken organza confections. In fact, I so loved the wedding dress that I wore in the movie's finale that the designer, Bill Thomas, offered to create the wedding dress for my real-life wedding day, which he did. At the heart of Babes in Toyland, which was first produced in 1903 for the stage, is Victor Herbert's music. We were all very proud when the film's soundtrack was nominated for an Academy Award that year. Herbert's classic songs, including Toyland and March of the Tin Soldiers, mark the film's highlights. March of the Tin Soldiers accompanies the toy soldiers, led by a miniaturized Tom Piper, in their rescue of Mary and attack on Barnaby. Using what were then very advanced techniques, the toys, some of which moved mechanically, seemed to come to life. In the early 60s, the charge of the toy soldiers represented the forefront of stop-motion animation, or Animotion, as the Disney crew called it. One other aspect of making Babes in Toyland that makes the experience even more precious to me was Mr. Disney. I had spent so much of the past couple of years traveling and recording, I realized how much I missed my home. The cast included many children, and it warmed my heart to see Mr. Disney visit the set each day and show the same interest in them as he had shown in me and the other Mouseketeers. It also made me realize that in so many ways my days in Toyland were coming to an end. For the rest of 1961 and through 62, Disney's record label, Buena Vista, released a stream of singles, mostly tracks taken from the Hawaiianette and Italianette albums. While my records remained popular with fans and sold well, the days of big hits were over for me, and my appearances on such music-oriented programs such as the Dick Clark shows tapered off. Still, fan mail poured in, and the phone rang constantly with requests from magazines for interviews and photo sessions. In early 1962, Mom and I traveled to Italy. There I was to begin filming Escapade in Florence, another Disney film that was shown in the States only on Walt Disney's Wonderful World of Color. Of all the places my work had led us, Italy still stands out as our favorite. Even though I was 21, I remained happily at home in 1963. In the next 3 years, I made 8 feature films, and in each I played the girl next door. In the last 2 Disney feature films I made, The Misadventures of Merlin Jones and its sequel, The Monkey's Uncle, the emphasis was on pure. How or why the image of me presented in these films has endured to be both loved and parodied often at the same time is frankly beyond me. I think one of the reasons the characters I played in these films became so popular is because of their purity, even prudery. They contradicted the message of the accepted stereotype and flew in the face of the sexual revolution. I felt that by taking such roles, I'd be letting down everyone at Disney and my family and friends and my fans. This brings us to the Beach Party movies, the first of which, Beach Party, was filmed and released between the two Merlin Jones films. In the wake of Beach Party's phenomenal success, a slew of sequels followed, all adhering to the same elementary formula. In early 60s America, the teenage vision of paradise was the beach, and not just any beach either, but those of the California Pacific Coast. Before there were beach movies, there was beach music, or more specifically, surf music. Riding the crest of the surf music wave were my good friends Jan Berry and Dean Torrance, better known as Jan and Dean. Surf City, the first #1 surf hit, topped the chart the week before our first beach picture premiered. The Beach Boys, whose biggest early hits like Surfin' USA defined the style, and the fabulous and seemingly eternal guitarist Dick Dale. I'm so happy to see that Dick is as appreciated today, nearly 25 years after his Let's Go Trippin' kicked off the surf music craze. I don't think you had to be a marketing genius to recognize the potential of a film that would glorify and capitalize on those teenage obsessions. And while other studios and producers made their share of beach movies, I don't think anyone approached the task with the same wry perspective and sense of fun as our producers, James Nicholson and Samuel Arkoff. They had already decided on the male lead, Frankie Avalon. When Mr. Nicholson first met with Mr. Disney to discuss the possibility of my co-starring in the movie, he had no idea that Frankie and I even knew each other, let alone that we were good friends. Mr. Nicholson had no reason to think Mr. Disney would approve of the project and agree to loan me out. Apparently, many producers had approached Mr. Disney before about me, but he always found something wrong with the films they wanted to cast me in. Yet something about Beach Party appealed to him. One day as I was walking down Mickey Avenue, he approached me, script in hand, and said, "Annette, can I see you for a minute?" "I've read this," he said, smiling. "It's good, clean fun, and I think you'll have a wonderful time doing it. But I do have a special little request." "Okay," I said, somewhat curious. "Now, I see that all the other girls are going to be running around in bikinis, which is fine. But Annette, I want you to be different. You are different. I would simply like to request that you not expose your navel in the film." "Mr. Disney, that's not a problem. Of course I won't," I replied. I wasn't on the set very long, however, before I found out that not everyone was thrilled by my compliance with Mr. Disney's request. As shooting continued, invariably a producer or director would try to persuade me to wear something more revealing. Several times I was practically taunted. "So you still have to follow the boss's orders?" I stood my ground. I was quaking inside, but I refused to let myself be bullied into doing what everyone else was doing. We started filming in March 1963, a $300,000 budget that was considered skimpy even in those days. When we filmed on the beach, it was early in the morning and always shiveringly cold, especially after they'd hose us down so we looked like we just came out of the surf. Other scenes were shot on a soundstage that had been filled with tons and tons of sand. We finished all the scenes within 3 weeks. Soon after its August 1963 release, Beach Party had recouped its costs several times over. Audiences, kids especially, loved the movie because it was simply fun. Here was the beginning of the ongoing Frankie and Annette saga. In the film's opening sequence, after singing our way down a coastal highway in our hot rods stacked with beach blankets and surfboards, we arrive at what Frankie believes will be our private little lover's nest. Of course, Dee Dee had invited the whole gang to stay with them, so there goes Frankie's big plans for romance. You know it's more fun with the whole gang, Dee Dee explains. Not what I had in mind, Frankie replies. But Dee Dee wasn't a cold fish either. As she confesses to Frankie, I don't trust myself with you. And though Frankie and Dee Dee would find themselves in variations of this impasse, many times in the coming films, Frankie just couldn't or wouldn't get Dee Dee's message. Not without a ring, you don't. The beach party movies aren't often thought of in terms of their music, but the famous musical acts that appeared in them comprised an impressive roster. In addition to Dick Dale and the Deltones, we beach kids played host to the Pyramids, the Exciters, the Hundells, and the Kingsmen, who popularized the immortal Louie Louie. Perhaps the biggest star to have made a film debut in one of our films was Stevie Wonder, then 13-year-old little Stevie Wonder. In just a few years, the beach party genre faded. But for whatever reason, blame Sunday afternoon and late-night TV movies, these films have found new audiences and stood the test of time in their appeal. For me, their success is pretty ironic, considering I'd always hated the beach. The sea air made my hair frizzy, and as for surfing, forget it. Through 1964 and 65, I also guest starred on TV programs like Wagon Train, The Greatest Show on Earth, and Burke's Law. In the 20 years that I was basically retired from show business, people often asked if I didn't miss the work, the excitement, the glamour. So many things contributed to my decision, knowing I'd never find a work environment as safe and supportive as the one I had known at Disney. The unfamiliarity of new sets and crews, the shocking, or at least to me, lack of ethics and morals that I saw. I could see from the kinds of scripts I was being offered that producers wanted to see Annette grown up in ways that were unacceptable to me. I wasn't a good enough actress to be something I wasn't, or to do things that I wouldn't do otherwise. On Father's Day 1964, right after The Monkey's Uncle was finished and Muscle Beach Party hit the screen, my retirement plans were set when my agent, Jack Gilardi, asked my father for my hand in marriage. I had known Jack for several years. In fact, we first met at the Hollywood Bowl when I was introduced to Frankie Avalon. At the time, Jack was Frankie's agent and later Fabian's as well. Around 1963, when I began working away from Disney, he became my agent. We had known each other as manager and client and as friends. One evening, I don't know what happened, he looked at me and I looked at him, and suddenly we knew we were in love. We shared the same basic values and had the same ideas about married life. Soon, I was wearing a 3.5-carat diamond engagement ring. Because I believed I would marry only once in my life, and because Mom and Dad never had a formal wedding, they went all out for mine. As promised years before, designer Bill Thomas created my wedding gown of satin covered with imported French Chantilly lace, with a 5-foot-long cathedral train frosted with crystal beads. The headpiece was adapted from the one I wore during the wedding scene of Babes in Toyland. My bridesmaids, good friends Shelley Fabaret, actress Noreen Corcoran, Arlene Ludwig, Irene Sloan, Shirley Mansour, and Laurie Nicholson, wore formal gowns of lush red velvet. The ushers, who included Frankie Avalon and Harvey Lembeck, all looked handsome in their black tuxedos. On the morning of the wedding, Mom opened the newspaper and turned to the comics. There, Charles Schulz paid tribute to the day in his Peanuts comic strip by showing Linus reading a paper, clutching his security blanket, and crying, "I can't stand it. This is terrible. How depressing. Annette Funicello has grown up." I suppose my dad felt the same way. As we walked down the aisle together, he squeezed my hand tightly and I his. Then I kissed him. I wanted to find the words to tell him that I would always be his little dolly, but I think he knew. Unfortunately, shortly before the wedding, I learned that Mr. Disney would not be able to attend. Like so many others who knew him, I had no idea that he was beginning to suffer from excruciating pain, the early signs of cancer that would take his life less than 2 years later. Also missing was my dear friend Jimmy Dodd, who had died in Hawaii only 2 months before from a rare blood condition. So it was a bittersweet day in some ways. Yet as I looked back at my family and my friends, I felt every bit the fairy tale princess whose Prince Charming had arrived to sweep her away to the happily ever after. I honestly felt that I was ready for marriage, and I was very happy. Yet I had not anticipated how much I would miss my family. Our Mexican honeymoon was splendidly romantic, until my nose started to bleed from the high altitude in the middle of a candlelight dinner. To make things even worse, I reached into my pocket for a handkerchief and pulled out one that belonged to my mother. When I saw her initials embroidered on it, I started crying. "I want to go home," I said, sobbing. Jack and I had a minor spat and didn't talk for 2 days. I suppose if I had traveled alone more, or if I had spent some time on my own before I married, it might have been different. All I could think of was home. By the time Jack and I arrived back in Los Angeles, we were again the happy newlyweds. My parents met us at the airport, and I was so happy to see them. Mom looked me over closely and said, "Annette, you're pregnant. You have that look in your eyes like I've never seen before." And sure enough, Mom was right. Shortly after returning from New York, where I jumped and danced in a hullabaloo segment, my doctor confirmed my mother's suspicions. There I was, married less than 3 weeks with a baby on the way. All grown up indeed. Settled into our Beverly Hills apartment, enjoying my new marriage, thinking of my new baby, I never thought I could be happier. I felt something in myself change. Most of my life, I'd always looked to my parents and later to Jack for support and encouragement. Now, becoming a mother meant for the first time in my life, someone would be totally dependent on me. I never took parenthood lightly, and I waited out the ensuing months fully aware of the awesome responsibility that would soon come. I was still in my early months when we began shooting How to Stuff a Wild Bikini. With me tastefully covered in oversized sweaters for the chilly evening beach scenes and roomy tops for the others, no one would suspect that I was expecting. While other cast members talked about where they'd like to go out after we finished shooting, or what their next job would be, I contentedly dreamed of hand-knitted booties, fluffy pastel blankets, and the sweet smell of baby powder. On October 17th, 1965, our first child, Gina Lurie, was born at St. Joseph's Hospital, right across the street from the Disney studio. When I first came out from under the anesthesia and opened my eyes to see my baby, my heart filled with love and thanks to God for sending her to me. How can I express how I felt the first time I held her and her blue eyes gazed up into mine? How can you describe a miracle? Within hours of Gina's birth, my hospital room overflowed with flowers, including a stunning bouquet of lavender roses from Jack. You can imagine the looks on people's faces when Mickey Mouse, Minnie, and Donald Duck came strutting down the maternity ward corridor bearing flowers from Walt Disney. You might think this is slightly surreal, but I felt perfectly natural calling out, "Hi, Mickey. Hi, Minnie. Hi, Donald." Enclosed with the flowers was a very moving, heartfelt note to me, which I still treasure. Now the world has 2 dolls. Very sincerely, Walt Disney. A few days later, Jack, Gina, and I were at home, a little family at last. Following an old Italian tradition, Gina didn't leave the house until the day she was christened, in early November at the same church where only 10 months before Jack and I were married. Not long after that, we moved into our home in Encino, not far from my parents' house. I still live there today. We had our daughter, our health, our family, and the house of our dreams. What more could anyone ask for? Except for a few guest appearances on television, I was, for all intents and purposes, retired. I adored Gina and poured my heart into every task. Gina made being a first-time mother so easy. She was bright, calm, attentive, and hardly ever whined or cried. Of course, with her mother and father, her grandparents, her uncles, and our many friends doting on her, it would have been hard for her to be anything but a contented child. These were golden days, but life always seems to have a way of crashing down on you when you least expect it. I suppose that because Mr. Disney had such a constant presence in my life for so many years, I never dreamed of the day he'd be gone. I last saw Mr. Disney in late 1965. He appeared noticeably tired and drawn, but I reasoned that he was in his early 60s by then and still keeping the schedule of a man half his age. He was also in the midst of executing his grand plans for his second fantasy park, Disney World, and the project nearest to his heart, Epcot. What I and most people who worked for Mr. Disney didn't know was that his health had been faltering, the result of old polo injuries and a heavy smoking habit. Despite that, he still tried to oversee every studio project in the works, his unerring eye for detail undimmed. In early November 1966, he entered St. Joseph's Hospital after suffering intense pain and shortness of breath. Even after the surgeons discovered cancer and removed his left lung, very few people knew how seriously ill he was. After a brief recuperation period, he returned to work, by all accounts even more driven than ever to see his last projects through. Despite his protests to the contrary, Mr. Disney grew weaker by the day. After spending Thanksgiving with his wife and family at his daughter Diane's house, he returned home and soon re-entered St. Joseph's Hospital, where from his bed he could look out his window and across the street to the studio he had built over 3 decades before. Over the next 2 weeks, his condition deteriorated rapidly, and after spending an evening discussing plans for Disney World and Epcot with his brother Roy, Mr. Disney passed away the next morning. I was cleaning the house and listening to the radio. I always had it tuned to a rock station. While polishing a table in my den, I felt myself jolted as if out of a dream when the announcer said, "Walt Disney died today." My immediate reaction was to think that this was some kind of a sick joke, or maybe a mistake. But as the hours wore on and my phone began ringing with reporters asking my reaction, I knew it had to be true. I sank down in a sofa and cried. The day after Mr. Disney's death, his body was cremated and his remains interred at Forest Lawn Cemetery, following a private funeral attended only by his family. It felt strange to have someone so close to me pass away and not be able to see him or in some way pay one last tribute. That night I watched television, listening numbly as anchormen tried to put into words all that Mr. Disney had meant to the world and how he would be missed. Yet all I could think of was that I had lost a very dear friend, a guardian angel. In the years after I started my family, the pop music world I'd been so much a part of before was drastically redefined. The teen idols, Frankie, Paul, Fabian, Ricky Nelson, were swept away as new sounds and styles conquered the charts. Long hair, bell-bottoms, drugs, and free love were now the buzzwords and legacy of a new generation. One day I received a script titled, appropriately, Untitled. As I perused the first several pages, it was clear that this script was unlike any I'd ever seen. It had descriptions of brief, seemingly unrelated scenes and nonsensical dialogue that was totally incomprehensible. All I knew about it was that it had been co-written by Bob Rafelson and Jack Nicholson for the Monkees, and that they wanted me to be in it. Of course, I knew the Monkees, Davy Jones, Mickey Dolenz, Mike Nesmith, and Peter Tork from their hit primetime television series and their hit records. My part, which was just a cameo role, was to play Davy's girlfriend. She begs him not to give up the violin to become a champion boxer. What did it mean? Don't ask me. In 1968, when I got a chance to see the finished film, by then titled Head, I must admit that it made no more sense to me then than it ever had. But it was a challenging offbeat role, and I was happy to play it. On February 10th, 1970, Gina welcomed her new little baby brother, Jack Gilardi, Jr. From the moment Jackie started walking at an amazing 9 months of age, I never got another full night's sleep. He quickly learned to maneuver the kitchen stepladder into the foyer, climb it, and then open the front door. On several occasions, I found him wandering in the front yard perilously close to the street. Finally, we had no choice but to install a security system, so at least when he opened the doors, an alarm would sound. I've known lots of children, but very few like Jackie. Kind-hearted, well-meaning, an accident waiting to happen, I always called him. In fact, his family nickname was Perpetual Motion. Within a year, Gina started school, beginning my life as a carpooling mother. Today, when people asked what I did for those missing 20 years, I say carpool, and people think I'm kidding, but I'm not. I really wanted to be with my kids. I enjoyed them. When we were first married, I tried my best to accompany Jack wherever he had to go for business. Naturally, Jack was expected to attend evening performances, dinners, parties, and in the beginning, I accepted this as something that was required of me too. But I never truly enjoyed it, and I never really fit in among the Hollywood glitterati. I always made it a point to stay near friends or the wives of other agents we knew, where we could discuss our home lives and our kids. For his part, and to his credit as an agent, Jack loved the Hollywood life. He gradually began going to functions alone, which meant he spent less time at home with children, and I spent less time with him. Slowly, I became a fish out of water in his world, and he in mine. However, our relationship was not anything near what you would call a bad marriage. I resolved to stick it out and make it work. Born in 1974, Jason, my youngest, was a very calm baby. Every child is special, but Jason will always be a little extra special because he is a baby. Of all my children, Jason bears the closest physical resemblance to me. I have to admit that more than once I've caught a glimpse of Mouseketeer Annette on television and asked myself, what is Jason doing on television with those silly ears on? In our home, there were relatively few hard and fast rules. Be truthful, be responsible, be willing to accept blame for your mistakes. My parents wisely had an open-door policy. My friends were always welcome, and I did the same. Sure, we had our fights. There were friends and love interests that I didn't approve of. There were decisions they made that I vehemently opposed. But that's part of being a good parent, too. In the end, I'm happy and proud to say that my children, who had no choice but to be my children, have also chosen to be my friends. For that, I will always be grateful. Since through my career, art has imitated life and vice versa, destiny surely had a hand when I was asked to portray myself, a typical American mom, for a series of Skippy peanut butter commercials. I'm not exactly sure how the Skippy people found me, except that my love for peanut butter was pretty well known. I always had jars of Skippy in the house, so it was easy for me to pitch because I really believed in it. I was Skippy's spokesperson for a decade. In the first couple of years, Gina, Jackie, and Jason played my kids in the commercials. But after finding out that viewers spent more time looking at my kids than paying attention to the spot, the Skippy people decided to use child actors instead. Over the years, I've endorsed a number of products, but I'll probably always be remembered for issuing the Skippy Challenge, which has more protein, and bologna and tuna fish are not the correct answers. When you're young and healthy, it never occurs to you that in a single second your life can change. Certainly I had taken my good health for granted, so that when something did happen to me, it came as a bolt out of the blue. Only later, when I discussed the incident with several doctors, did I learn that this might have been the first warning sign of multiple sclerosis. It was late one evening in 1976, and everyone was asleep except me. I was washing my face at the sink in the master bath when suddenly the room grew dark and started spinning. I heard loud, crashing bells that sounded so real I had to cover my ears even though the sound was coming from within. Unfortunately, I ignored my first impulse, which was to sit down and wait it out or call for help. Instead, I tried to make my way from the bathroom to the bed to awaken Jack. After one step, I tripped and went flying headfirst into a large, heavy dresser that was ornately carved with sharp points. Everything went black. I have no idea how long I laid on the floor, half unconscious and moaning. Thank God Jack heard me and jumped out of bed. The first thing I remember hearing was him screaming, "Your eye! Annette, your eye is gone. What happened to your eye?" I struggled to open my right eye, but it stayed closed. Instinctively raising my hands to my face, I felt something warm and wet, flesh and blood, not my face at all. Of course I was in shock, but I didn't know that then. Jack just helped me walk to the bathroom. I need to brush my teeth before we go to the hospital. The neighbors agreed to watch the kids, and we drove to the hospital. I was lying in the emergency room, and after they'd stopped the bleeding, a doctor approached and asked, "Do you know a plastic surgeon?" "No, I never used one," I replied, wondering what they were talking about. In the meantime, Jack called my parents, who came as quickly as they could. When a plastic surgeon finally arrived and set to work, I lay there calmly and peacefully. It was like a dream. As the doctor worked slowly and meticulously, restoring tissue and glands to their correct positions, I remained in an odd state of alertness. I remember asking him, "Doctor, I have no eyebrows. What am I going to do?" And him replying, "Oh, here's some. I found some." 125 stitches later, everything was back in place, but regardless of how beautifully the incisions healed, the incident troubled me for a long time to come. How could I, someone who had never experienced dizziness once in her life, suddenly be so overcome? And those bells ringing, what caused that? No one could give me an answer. The doctors I talked with wrote it off as something that just happened, a fluke, a once-in-a-lifetime accident that probably would never happen again. About 6 weeks later, I felt well enough to get back to my usual routine. I was driving along the freeway and getting ready to move into the right-hand lane when I looked across and saw a huge black area. I checked the rear-view mirror, and again all I saw to my right was blackness. I calmly moved to the right and pulled onto the shoulder. Sitting there, I hit myself on the head and cried, "Come on, what's going on here?" After a few minutes, I started the car and cautiously proceeded the short distance home. The neurologist I consulted believed that the blindness was probably attributable to the fall. It did pass. However, I've continued to have a black spot in my vision ever since. Through the 70s, I appeared infrequently as a guest star on various television programs. Probably the biggest television event was the Mouseketeers reunion special commemorating the show's 25th anniversary in 1980. No amount of anticipation could account for the almost magical feeling of standing on Soundstage 1 with 38 other original Mouseketeers. In some ways, it was like being granted a golden wish to return to your childhood, and not many people ever get that. One day, I gathered Gina, Jackie, and Jason together on my bed. I said, "I have something to tell you. You know, Daddy and I haven't been getting along well lately, so he's going to be going away for a little while. We're going to have a trial separation and try to work things out. but I'm sure he'll be back. It had taken me years to finally ask Jack for a separation. Going straight from my parents' home to a husband's felt natural back in 1965. But as I matured, I began to see that marriage wasn't as easy as cutting the wedding cake. Looking back on the experience, I have to confess I didn't really know how to make it work. I didn't know how to be a real partner or how to give and take. Our situation was also complicated by a very basic difference in our natures. After years of growing apart, I had to admit that my marriage was coming to an end. I was not prepared to live as a single parent. The parent part I had down pretty well. It was the single business I had trouble with. When I informed Jack that I'd be taking care of all the bills and running the household rather than having our business manager do it, I had no idea what I was getting into. Although nearing 40, I had never once balanced a checkbook. I didn't understand how the mortgage worked or how and when to pay the property taxes. Between my parents and Jack, I had never worried about money in my life. I was greatly relieved to learn some years later that there are many women from all walks of life whose experience was similar to mine. But at the time, I felt absolutely helpless and inept. After a few years of being alone, I met the man who would become my second and last husband, Glenn Holt. Actually, I should say re-met him, since Glenn and I have known each other casually since I was 18. Glenn bred and raced trotters, so he often had horses at Hollywood Park in the stables near ours. After my divorce, Mom and I would take the kids there. One day we were sitting in our box when Glenn came up and asked if he could sit with us. We got to talking and soon learned that we were both divorced. It wasn't love at first sight or anything quite so dramatic. We went to dinner with my parents a few times, and then we went out alone. We fell in love, and on Valentine's Day 1985, Glenn proposed, and I accepted. If someone had told me before that one day I'd marry a cowboy, I'd have laughed. But that's what Glenn prides himself on being. I don't think I've ever known anyone who is so self-sufficient and independent. An ex-policeman turned rancher, Glenn is the quintessential country boy. Sometimes in the beginning, Glenn and I would go out to our Kern County ranch, maybe attend a rodeo or a county fair, and then I'd wake up the next morning to the roosters crowing and the horses whinnying. Under a rough-and-tough exterior, Glenn is a romantic. I'd often wake up and find he's cut some roses from the backyard for me or written "I love you" on a Post-it note and stuck it to the fridge. Although I spent most of my time with Glenn or the kids, I did fulfill a lifelong dream by recording a country music album. I'd told Glenn that I wanted to write a song for my parents that would tell the world what they'd done for me and my brothers and how much I loved them. I'd never written a song in my life, but slowly the lyrics started coming together, and before I knew it, I had written a song called The Promised Land. My only other major project around that time was co-starring with comedian Martin Mull in the Disney Channel film Lots of Luck. It was nice to be working again, but even nicer to be back on the Disney studio lot for the first time since The Monkey's Uncle 20 years before. Had it really been so many years? I didn't feel any older. If anything, I felt as if my life were beginning again. On May 3rd, 1986, Glenn and I married. We planned a small, intimate ceremony followed by a dinner for about 50 people in a local restaurant. Gina was my maid of honor, and Jackie and Jason took part in the ceremony, as did two of Glenn's 4 grown children. I had everything planned, but I wanted to invite one very special guest, Mickey Mouse. But because of a new corporate policy, the characters could no longer be loaned out. A few days later, I got a call from Arlene Ludwig, who had been a bridesmaid at my first wedding. She had some good news. Annette, everyone here at Disney talked it over, and we believed that Walt Disney would have wanted Mickey to be at your wedding, so he can come. The day of the wedding was absolutely beautiful. As he had the first time, my father walked me down the aisle. He was quite emotional about it, only this time he whispered, "I don't ever want to have to do this again, Dolly." "Don't worry, Dad," I whispered back. "You won't." We had a simple ceremony, and then it was off to the reception. At one point during the reception, Glenn and I toasted each other. I said, "I love you, honey, and I know the second time around is always better. I just want you to know that I want to make it to the finish line with you," and I meant it. When Glenn opened the door and saw Mickey in a bow tie and tux holding a platter of cheese, his jaw dropped. Everyone in the room burst out laughing and applauding. Mickey and I danced together, and it was so lovely. Mickey is more than a mouse to me. I'm honored to call him my friend. As 1987 began, I was entering a new phase of my life. Glenn and I still felt like newlyweds. My children were well on their way to independence. I was proud of each of them and so happy to see them grow up into such great kids. But time was passing too quickly. The years of all-consuming momhood would be coming to a close soon. With Glenn gone a few days a week taking care of business at the ranch, I began to think about my career again. I wasn't about to jump at anything, but if the right project came along, I was game. Frankie Avalon and I had discussed reviving our swingin' and surfin' alter egos in an updated beach party film. When Frankie first approached me with the idea, I said, "Okay, as long as we could create something we both would be proud of." As executive producers, we met with several teams of writers and posed the question, what would Frankie and Dee Dee be doing today, 20 years later? Of course, they would have to be married. Dee Dee, as you well know, wouldn't have it any other way, and there'd be a couple of kids. We wanted to spoof the old films, but we wanted the audience to laugh with us, not at us. It took us a while to get what we wanted, but we finally struck that fine balance. Having been forced to retire from the beach after a traumatic surfing accident, Frankie, also known as the Big Kahuna, married Annette, not Dee Dee this time, and they lived somewhere in Ohio. A highly stressed car dealer, Frankie had forgotten how to have fun, while Annette seemed oblivious of everything except shopping. Her kitchen shelves were a virtual wall of Campbell's soup cans and Skippy peanut butter jars. Still balancing that bouffant hairdo, my character, whom Frankie describes as having been in a good mood for 22 years, has a disposition as perky as her polka-dot wardrobe. As for our children, our son was a young teenage punk, and our fairly normal daughter was in college in California at the beach. A big change from its low-budget predecessors. Back to the Beach cost $9 million. We had a huge and wonderful cast, including Connie Stevens, Ed Cookie Burns, Bob Denver, Alan Hale Jr., Barbara Billingsley, Jerry Mathers, and Tony Dow. It was while reading my script for Back to the Beach that I first noticed something was wrong. It seemed as if every time I started to read, The letters on the page appeared blurrier and smaller, and it took me an unusually long time to focus. In a matter of weeks, my vision worsened so rapidly that I had to consult an ophthalmologist. He prescribed reading glasses, which helped considerably for a while. But when we began filming, I started to experience other strange things that concerned me. Every now and then I would feel a cold tingling sensation in my hands and feet that would come and go for no apparent reason. Once we started shooting out on the beach, I found it difficult to keep my balance in the sand. Several times, the simple act of getting up from a sitting position left me feeling wildly off-kilter, as if I'd been spinning. I started to panic. Suddenly, my own body seemed beyond my control. I was telling it to do things, and it just wasn't listening. Typically, I kept this to myself. I didn't want to sound like a complainer. There was probably a logical explanation for it. My problems with balance remained pretty consistent, neither improving or worsening over the course of filming. But a couple of months after getting myself a stronger pair of reading glasses, the letters looked as fuzzy as ever. When I went to my eye doctor for the third time in less than 6 months, he was visibly concerned. He performed a test in which he injected some dye into my bloodstream. The dye collected in my eyes, making it easier for him to see blockages, abnormalities, or infection. He examined me very carefully. After he finished, he said nothing about what he saw or what he suspected. But I knew immediately from his subdued tone of voice that he'd discovered something terribly wrong. My testing is not really extensive, he said. I'm going to refer you to a neurologist, a doctor who specializes in the brain. As chance would have it, the neurologist I'd consulted when I injured my eye several years earlier had an office in the same building. An appointment was made for that same day. Without mentioning a possible cause, the neurologist suggested I go for a diagnostic test, a scan called an MRI. The MRI is currently considered one of the best ways to make a definite diagnosis of multiple sclerosis. Several days after the scan, as I sat in the doctor's office with my mother and Glenn, the doctor's words seemed to hang in the air. Multiple sclerosis. MS. I heard him speaking, but I couldn't seem to grasp what he was saying or what it meant for me. All I can recall feeling at that moment, oddly, was relief. Thank you, God. I don't have a brain tumor. I'm not going to die. Gradually, I began to absorb what he was saying, although I must admit, very little of it sank in that day. Multiple sclerosis is an illness of the central nervous system, the brain, and the spinal cord. Both organs contain literally billions of nerve cells, thin, fragile fibers that constantly relay thousands of sensations, impulses, messages, and commands between the brain and every other part of the body. Protecting the nerve cells is a coating of white, fatty substance called myelin. Like the plastic insulation on a piece of electrical wire, the myelin forms a protective barrier around the nerve cells. It also ensures that the messages traveling along the cells at an amazing 225 miles per hour complete their journey quickly and deliver their information accurately so that our brains can issue the appropriate response. Even a simple, seemingly automatic act that one takes for granted, such as accidentally touching a hot stove and pulling back one's hand, results from a series of nearly instantaneous exchanges between the nerve cells in the hand, the brain, and other nerve cells in the muscles. The symptoms of MS result from a multi-stage process in which the myelin sheath becomes inflamed and damaged, followed by the body's attempts to repair the myelin. This process, called remyelination, makes possible the sudden disappearance of symptoms and the common but unpredictable remissions many people with MS experience. As the doctor spoke, my head filled with questions. Was there a cure? When could I start treatment? What did the future hold for me and my family? How did I get it? When would it go away? I soon learned what everyone who lives with MS knows all too well. There simply are no answers to these and hundreds of other questions this baffling illness raises. There are several leading theories that attempt to explain MS, but so far none have been proven conclusively and none have been ruled out. Believe it or not, as serious chronic illnesses go, multiple sclerosis came with some good news, relatively speaking. For starters, it is not fatal, nor is it always progressive. Contrary to popular belief, MS is not really a degenerative illness like Alzheimer's disease or ALS, also known as Lou Gehrig's disease. Whereas those two conditions follow a predictable course marked by continued and dramatic loss of functional ability, MS is distinguished by its unpredictability. Theoretically, the possibility of complete or at least long-term remission of symptoms exists for almost everyone. There are those, like singer Lola Falana and many others I've spoken to or corresponded with over the years, who one day awaken to find their symptoms have disappeared. I also learned that while, yes, my symptoms could persist, increase, or otherwise cause me greater discomfort and inconvenience, it was also true that this might be the worst I ever got. There was simply no way to know. I left the doctor's office feeling both relieved and depressed. It is well known that people who face death or serious illness go through several steps of emotional adjustment: denial, bargaining, anger, depression, and finally acceptance. In my case, it didn't follow that course exactly, because although I was diagnosed as having MS, for 4 years I enjoyed something of a reprieve. My eyesight didn't improve and my balance was sometimes off, but other than a slight tingling or numbness in my hands and feet, I felt fine. Looking back, I can see that I went through my own stage of denial, which manifested itself in my avoiding everything and anything that had to do with MS. I just didn't want to know anything more than I did. I'd always had a tendency to shrink from the unknown, and at first MS was exactly that. I felt that the less I knew, the less afraid I would be. I have to say now that I think this was my biggest mistake in dealing with MS, and it's something I don't recommend to anyone. It's human nature to want to avoid what makes us uncomfortable, anxious, or sad. But in the end, I realized the unknown is the most frightening. Today, my first advice to anyone who has MS is to learn all that you can and to read every piece of literature you can get your hands on. talk to people who have MS or know someone who does. There's a wealth of anecdotal information, tips on how to cope with certain common situations, and practical advice out there waiting for you. Make use of it as early and as often as you can. Shortly after my diagnosis, Back to the Beach was released amid a flurry of publicity, all of it nostalgic and upbeat. Of course, there were a few critics who didn't warm up to the film, but overall, the press and public gave us a wonderful reception. By all measures, the film was a big enough success to warrant a sequel. But I had MS, and now I was faced with deciding whether or not to tell Frankie the truth. Initially, I opted not to tell him because I was feeling so well, but then I realized I was being a little selfish. I saw Frankie's excitement over the new movie and his enthusiasm for its sequel. I let him know gently and vaguely that I didn't really want to do the next film. Oddly enough, one of the unexpected results of having MS was also one of the more positive. Almost a year after Back to the Beach came out, Frankie called and asked, "So are you ready to hit the road?" "What?" I replied. "Frankie, you know I hate to travel, and I'm scared to death to sing live." "Yes, Annette, but I also know that Jason just turned 16 and got his license. So your carpooling days are over. What do you say?" "Frankie, let me think about it, okay?" I hung up the phone and sat there asking myself, what am I so afraid of? People want to see us. Suddenly I caught myself thinking, I may not always be able to do this. I could be in a wheelchair or worse. This could be my last chance. I knew that I could either face my demons and go out there and do it, or risk the possibility that one day I'd regret not having gone. I hate regrets, so for one of the first times in my life, I pushed fear aside. I think Frankie went into shock when I told him to go ahead and set the wheels in motion. It wasn't much longer before we were in Dick Clark's office planning an itinerary. Being with Dick again, boy, what memories that brought back. I said I wanted to work mainly weekends, and I wanted to be able to come home every few dates. That seemed doable, so we were set. We started with just a few fall dates in 1989, beginning in Yakima, Washington. Our show did so well that Frankie and I were often back on the road for the next year and a half. Within just the first few dates, I began to feel almost comfortable on stage. And I suppose knowing in the back of my mind that I might not ever do this again made it even sweeter. The fear that I might lose my balance on stage never left me, though. At one point in one of our skits, Frankie bends me back and kisses me. There were a couple of times when I wasn't sure if I was going to be able to pull myself upright. Soon, however, Frankie started holding me a little tighter, and I said a silent thank you and marveled at how sensitive Frankie was. Although we performed in over 30 cities from spring into fall, the most memorable show for me was the one we did in my birthplace in May. Because we still had so many relatives nearby and others flew in from around the country, the show became a family reunion. I wanted to plan something very special for my parents. Through the tour, Frankie's sons had been playing in the band, Tony on guitar and Frank Jr. on drums. We agreed to fly Jason secretly to Utica. Right before my solo spot, the stage went dark, and unseen by the audience, Jason took Frankie Avalon Jr.'s place on drums. I said, "Please bring up the lights again. I have a big surprise for everybody. My son Jason is here from California to help me with a song that I wrote for my parents." I began with a short recitation. I don't remember too much about the trip from my birthplace to California since I was only 4, but I do know of the hard times my family had after reaching the Golden State that held the promise of a better way of life. And then I sang "From My City in the East to the City of the Angels." As the song came to a close, I could hear my father crying. Frankie introduced Jason on drums, and the audience went wild, especially my parents and relatives. Afterward, Jason kept saying, "Thanks, Mom." More than the highlight of the show, it was one of the highlights of my life. In January 1991, Frankie and I took our show to the Golden Nugget in Las Vegas. Frankie was familiar to Vegas audiences, having played that circuit for many years. But this was my first time, and it was exciting. As we performed our last dates, I began feeling more shaky on stage. The bottoms of my feet burned, and the tingling in my legs intensified. One night I said to Glenn, "I can't keep this from Frankie anymore." "Honey, don't worry," Glenn replied. "You don't have to tell him." "Yes, I do, Glenn. I feel like I'm living a lie. I have to tell Frankie." "Okay, darling," Glenn answered, "if that's what you think is right." The next morning, Frankie and I had breakfast together in our hotel. I was very nervous, not knowing how he would respond, but I suggested after breakfast, "Let's go down to the lounge. I have something I want to tell you." We sat on a couch together, and I began, "You know your friend Tom Dreesen, who puts on the telethon for his sister who had multiple sclerosis?" "Sure," he answered. "Well, every year he invites me, and I always have a reason why I can't go." "Do you know why?" Frankie shook his head. "Because, Frankie, I have what she had. I have MS." Frankie was shocked. A tear welled up in his eye. "Oh, Annette. That's why I'm so glad you've been holding me on stage when I walk close to the edge. That's why I'm so glad that you're there." We talked more and had a good cry together, and I felt as if someone had lifted a ton of weight off my shoulders. About 2 years later, I was on Vicki Lawrence's first TV talk show. I was being interviewed in my home, so I was talking into a camera lens while Frankie sat in the studio with Vicki. When the subject of my MS arose, through my earpiece I heard Frankie say, "Annette, Vicki, I have something to tell everybody that Annette has never found out." He proceeded to recount how Glenn told him about my MS before the tour began and asked him to watch out for me. I was stunned, but knowing I was on camera, I tried to hide my shock and, yes, I admit, my anger. I forget exactly what I said to Frankie while we were being taped, but the minute the camera went off, I was furious. "Glenn, why did you do that behind my back? You made me feel like a fool in front of everybody." "I was so worried about you, honey," he replied. "I know you like to go down to the edge of the stage and shake hands with people. I just had to do it." Then I was angry at Frankie because I felt that when I opened my heart to him, he should have told me he already knew. Can you imagine how I felt? In April of 1991, Glenn and I held a huge party to celebrate my parents' 50th wedding anniversary. Looking at my parents as they restated their vows, I couldn't believe they'd been married for 50 years. To see them together, you'd think they had just fallen in love yesterday. They recently moved to Palm Springs, which seemed like a good idea. Their moving was a heartbreaking experience for everyone. Their house had been the scene of many wonderful holidays and celebrations. It never occurred to me to go home again to my parents, but somehow, just knowing that my bedroom was still there made me happy. Although we visit back and forth quite often, I must say that I miss not having them a few minutes away. Although I generally felt fine through 1991, it was getting harder to deny that something was wrong. For a few days, I was overcome with what felt like a bad case of flu, complete with chills and fever so dangerously high that I had to lie in bed on packs of ice. Because I have MS and viral infections are known to exacerbate symptoms, I found myself suddenly unable to walk. If Glenn wasn't there to carry me, I had to maneuver myself onto the floor and crawl to the bathroom. It was terrifying, and yet after a few days, the symptoms disappeared. Now I walked unsteadily with a cane or leaning on someone's arm. Each time I left the house, I worried not only about how I would keep my balance, but how I would explain what was wrong. Over the past year, I'd spun a web of excuses and stories about my bad knee and my tendinitis. But lately I found just keeping up with the winding trail of white lies was getting harder. Even I could see in some friends' faces that the story wasn't adding up. Worst of all, though, was the stress that telling lies and keeping the story straight brought about. Before long, reporters got wind that there was something wrong with Annette. Pretty soon, reporters from the tabloids started hanging around my neighborhood, knocking on the doors and asking my neighbors, "What's wrong with Annette?" One phoned Glenn at the ranch, another phoned my brother Joe, who was also my agent, and then relatives back in Utica began getting calls. I was sitting at home when the phone rang. A man said he was from a leading supermarket tabloid. "We understand that you're ready to go public, and we're willing to pay you a handsome fee if you'll give us the exclusive." Without admitting anything was wrong, I stammered, "You mean you're talking dollars and cents when it comes to my health and my private life? No, thank you." By then, I was so furious and unnerved that the receiver shook in my hand. The only thing to do was to tell the story myself. I called my friend Arlene Ludwig at Disney immediately and said, "Arlene, this is it. I want to go public and I want to beat the tabloids." I chose Tom Green at USA Today because he'd interviewed me many times over the years, and I'd always liked and trusted him. I told him the whole story, and on the front page of USA Today's Life section ran the headline, "Funicello Fighting Multiple Sclerosis." I read and reread the story, feeling so exposed and yet so relieved. I could go anywhere and never have to lie again, nor would my kids, Glenn, and anyone else I cared for. The first time I went out in public and no one asked me what was wrong, I knew I had done the right thing. Going public also gave me countless opportunities to talk about MS and to heighten public awareness about this baffling illness. I decided that I would use my public recognition to do something concrete in the fight against MS. I founded the Annette Funicello Research Fund for Neurological Diseases. It will finance the search for the answers to MS as well as other illnesses, including Alzheimer's, Lou Gehrig's, and Parkinson's diseases. I follow the low-fat diet recommended for people with MS. I quit smoking, I exercise, I rest, and try to lead as stress-free a life as possible. Over the past 7 years, I believe I've come to terms with MS. While I fight the illness every way I can, I no longer fight the realization that I have it. This is not to say that I've given up hope, which I certainly have not and never will, but I've stopped expending valuable energy on the why of it all. I'll never know why, and instead focus on what's good about each day. Whether it be something as simple as a hug from one of my kids, or as grand as a public award, or as I used to sing about over 50 years ago, I accentuate the positive. It works. Through it all, the one constant in my life has been my faith. My faith in God is such that I believe my illness has a purpose and a meaning. Perhaps I can offer others comfort and hope. I feel the Lord is at my side, and with Him I know that all good things are possible. On Easter Sunday, 1993, I believe I felt Him especially close to me. My whole family had gathered for the weekend, and that morning I woke up and walked as easily as ever. It was as if the MS had suddenly vanished. My legs felt light, and my balance was perfect. For that whole day, I never needed my cane. I never teetered for a second. It seemed like a miracle. And yet, the next day, the symptoms returned. Now I pray that one day like that will come again, and then another, and another. My past 2 birthdays have been the occasions of the most wonderful celebrations of my life. In 1992, on Jason's birthday, the day before my 50th birthday, I was honored to receive the Disney Legends Award in recognition of my contribution to the Disney legacy. And in 1993, my birthday present was a star on Hollywood's Walk of Fame. The fall of 1993 found me busier than I'd been in years. Not only was I to receive my star, but Hollywood Records was releasing a double CD retrospective called Annette, a musical reunion with the girl next door. I think the most emotional event came at the close of the 2nd annual Disneyana Convention, an annual gathering of Disney fans and collectors. The convention's climax was a spectacular show at which I gave the tribute to Walt Disney that I had written with Glenn. The room was dark as a tape recording of me speaking played. Because these words best express my feelings about Mr. Disney, I'd like to share some of them here. Ever since the discovery of our great land, we've had many heroes, from George Washington to our present president. Many war heroes, many pioneers. A lot of our heroes have emerged from the big silver screen. But I want to tell you about a man I knew who was just as great a hero in my life. He never won any battles in war, but he won the love and respect of children and adults alike. In his films and his magical theme parks, he taught children how to love and appreciate nature. His dedication was not just making people smile. He taught in a special way respect for life and land the world over, making people realize if you wish upon a star, dreams really can come true. Many times I've visited his magic kingdoms, and believe me when I say my dreams came true. I always found Mr. Disney to be somewhat of a shy person, but a kid at heart. I guess that's why he always requested we all call him Uncle Walt. But that was a name I just couldn't bring myself to say, since he seemed more like a second father to me. Just to know him was to love him, and I'll never forget all the kindness he showed me. I can't say enough good things about this man who was loved so much by so many. Where does one begin? His dedication and accomplishments were second to none, and to think it all began with a little mouse. That's why when I think of heroes, I always think of him. God bless that man. In 1966, the world was saddened to hear of his death, but it's such a comfort to know that his soul lives on together with his dreams, and his memory will live forever in my heart. And then curtains parted, a light shone on me alone on the stage, and live I spoke the last line. So now, to fulfill your long request, Mr. Disney, I'll say good night, Uncle Walt. I was joined on stage by Lonnie Burr, Tommy Cole, Bobby Burgess, Sharon Baird, Sherry Alberoni, and Karen Pendleton. Together we all sang the Mickey Mouse Club March and then closed the show with the Mickey Mouse Club theme. In November, I was honored to receive the Helen Hayes Award from the St. Clair's Hospital and Health Center in New York City. I was chosen to receive the award in recognition of both my professional accomplishments and my work in raising public awareness about MS. With Glenn at my side and close friends all around, even sitting in my wheelchair, I felt fortunate and thankful. Life does not have to be perfect to be wonderful. How pleased I would be if I could end my story here by saying that my MS had gone into remission or had been cured. Unfortunately, I can't. But that doesn't mean that this story can't have a happy ending. As I have had so many opportunities to do over the past year, I simply stop and reflect on the many blessings that have been showered upon me. I draw strength from my belief that the Lord stands beside me, along with my parents, my children, my husband, my friends, and of course my fans, and Uncle Walt and Mickey Mouse. I have found peace knowing that wherever I go, however I may get there, they will be with me. In that way, whatever dreams I have wished have come true.